I was walking through the city, head down against the biting wind, when I saw it. Bright red, fluffy, with a pom-pom so large it seemed to defy gravity. The man wearing it was sitting on a folding chair at a bus stop, reading a newspaper. He didn't seem to care that his hat was drawing every pair of eyes within a 50-foot radius. A child walking by tugged at his mother's coat and pointed at the man. "Mom, it's Santa!" the kid exclaimed, and the man glanced up from his paper just long enough to smirk. The bus arrived, and Santa folded his chair, tucked it under his arm, and boarded like this was the most natural thing in the world. I stood there long after the bus pulled away, wondering if he was going somewhere important or if the hat itself was the destination. The city felt different after that, less like a place I lived and more like a puzzle I hadn't quite figured out yet. I kept walking, my senses sharper than before, as though the hat had rewired the way I saw the world. At the corner of Grand and 3rd, a man was fixing a traffic light. His cherry picker swayed gently above the street as he leaned out and fiddled with the wiring. Below him, a woman holding a bouquet of sunflowers was yelling up at him in a language I didn't understand. She wasn't angry, at least it didn't sound like it. Her voice was too musical for anger. The man shouted something back, then laughed, his voice echoing across the intersection. Whatever they were saying, it seemed like a conversation they'd been having for years. I crossed the street and passed a pizza shop where 2 delivery guys were arguing, their hands full of steaming boxes. One of them gestured wildly with his free hand, and the other shook his head, exasperated. In the midst of their bickering, a stray dog trotted up and sat patiently at their feet. The first guy noticed and broke into a grin. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a slice of pepperoni, and tossed it to the dog, who caught it midair with the precision of a trained acrobat. It was hard not to feel like everything around me had been secretly rehearsed. Further down the street, I stumbled upon a pop-up market I hadn't seen before. Stalls were crammed together like mismatched puzzle pieces, their awnings flapping in the wind. One vendor was selling mismatched teacups, each painted with delicate, faded flowers. Another had an assortment of vintage keys laid out on velvet, each one tagged with a handwritten note. "Opens a door in Paris, 1948, or unlocks the chest of secrets." A small crowd had gathered around a woman selling handmade puppets. She was demonstrating one of them, a lanky marionette with a crooked smile, and the way it moved was uncanny, like it had a life of its own. She made it bow extravagantly, and the crowd clapped as if the puppet had done it of its own volition. I stayed for a while, watching the marionette dance, but eventually the wind pushed me forward. As I turned onto Willow Lane, I noticed a man in a suit standing perfectly still in front of a shop window. His expression was so intense that I couldn't help but follow his gaze. Inside, a jeweler was adjusting a necklace on a black velvet bust. The man outside didn't move, didn't blink, as if the necklace held some kind of ancient secret meant only for him. Then, as abruptly as he had stopped, he walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Near the end of the street, I found a bench and sat down to watch the pigeons. They were everywhere, pecking at crumbs, fluttering up to perch on lampposts, strutting around like tiny, self-important mayors. One pigeon, smaller and scruffier than the rest, was struggling to drag a piece of bagel twice its size across the sidewalk. A group of teenagers on skateboards rolled past, scattering the pigeons in a flurry of wings. All except the little one with the bagel, who stood its ground, triumphant. By the time I got up, the sun was beginning to set, casting everything in a strange, golden light. The city buzzed on, as it always did, but now it felt like a story unfolding in real time, every detail part of some grander narrative I couldn't quite grasp. On my way home, I passed a mural I'd never noticed before. It stretched across the entire side of a building, a riot of colors and shapes that seemed to move if you stared at them too long. At the center of it was a phrase, scrawled in looping white letters. "Look closer." I stopped and read it again, and then again. So, here's my question for you. Let's start a new story. We met in a bookstore because of course we did. Some people meet at bars or through apps, but we met in the used section of an old, creaky shop that smelled like paper and rain. I've been standing in front of a shelf labeled Forgotten Gems for a while, flipping through a battered paperback with an uncomfortably cheesy cover. He appeared at my side out of nowhere, carrying a stack of books, so precarious it looked like a single wrong breath might topple it. "Let me guess," he said, glancing at the book in my hands. "A secret inheritance, a castle, and at least one dramatic duel." I looked up startled. "Close. A secret inheritance, a cursed amulet, and a woman who faints at least twice per chapter." "Sounds like a classic," he said, grinning. I laughed, holding it up for him to see the ridiculous cover art. Windswept hair, a stormy sky, and a man who looked like he did bicep curls with horses. "It's so bad, I might have to buy it." He tilted his head, appraising me like he wasn't sure if I was joking. "Or," he said slowly, "you could let me buy it for you, on one condition." "Is this where you tell me I have to give you my number?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Nope," he said, his grin widening. "You just have to read it. Like actually read it, then tell me if it's worth the $2.50. There was something about him, maybe the casual confidence or the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, that made me say yes. And just like that, I had plans for Friday night, reading the worst book I'd ever seen in exchange for a stranger's smile. But that's not the story. That's just the beginning. The real story started a week later when we met for coffee, so I could give him my full report. I'd made notes in the margins, writing things like, "Does nobody edit these anymore? And who faints this often? Seriously." He laughed so hard while flipping through it that the barista asked us to quiet down. "So," he said, still grinning as he tucked the book into his bag, "you suffered through it. I owe you now." "I don't think suffering's the word," I said, still laughing. "It was fun in a terrible way." "Well then," he said, leaning forward with a conspiratorial gleam in his eye. "What's your next terrible hobby?" I didn't have an answer, so he made one up. That's how we ended up at an estate sale the next weekend, wandering through a stranger's house while he narrated every item like we were in a museum. "This," he said, holding up a porcelain cat with one ear chipped off, "is obviously cursed. Probably grants wishes but eats your soul in return." "And this?" I asked, pointing to a faded oil painting of a ship caught in a storm. "Definitely haunted," he said without missing a beat. "The captain's ghost probably shows up every night, begging for someone to fix his rigging." It became our thing, finding beauty or hilarity in the odd and overlooked. One weekend, it was a flea market where he bought me a broken snow globe with a miniature Ferris wheel inside. Another time, we spent an entire afternoon photographing weird graffiti under a bridge. But the night that stayed with me forever, that was the carousel. We'd found it by accident, tucked away in a small park we'd never noticed before. It wasn't running. It looked like it hadn't in years, but the lights around the edge still worked, flickering softly like fireflies caught in the framework. "Bet it's haunted," he said, his default answer for anything old and mysterious. "I dare you to find out," I replied, giving him a playful nudge. To my surprise, he hopped the fence without hesitation. "Are you coming?" he called, his voice echoing in the stillness. I hesitated for half a second before climbing over to join him. The carousel creaked faintly as we stepped onto the platform, the horses frozen mid-gallop, their chipped paint gleaming in the dim light. "Pick a horse," he said, holding out his hand like he was inviting me to dance. I chose one with a missing eye and a saddle painted in faded gold. He climbed onto the horse beside mine, pretending to adjust imaginary reins. "What do you think they'd say if they could talk?" I asked, stroking the horse's neck. "Yours would probably say, 'Get off me, I'm retired,'" he said, laughing. "And yours?" He pretended to consider. "Mine would say, 'You're an idiot, but at least you make her laugh.'" The joke caught me off guard, and I felt my face flush in the dim light. Before I could reply, he hopped off his horse and fiddled with something near the center of the carousel. A moment later, music started to play. Not the creepy, tinny kind you'd expect, but a warm, haunting melody that seemed to pour out of the night itself. He turned to me, offering his hand again. "Dance with me?" There was no one around, no audience, no expectations, just the soft glow of the carousel lights and the faint hum of music. So I said yes. We danced in slow circles, stepping carefully around the platform's uneven boards. His hands were warm, his movements clumsy but sincere. At some point, I leaned my head against his shoulder, and he whispered, "This is kind of ridiculous, isn't it?" "Absolutely," I said. "But it's perfect." When the music stopped, we stayed for a while, sitting on the edge of the carousel and watching the stars. He told me stories about his childhood, how he used to build elaborate forts in the woods and pretend they were pirate ships. I told him about my favorite childhood book and how I used to read it aloud to my stuffed animals, giving each one a different voice. We stayed until the park lights flickered off, and the world felt impossibly dark and quiet. When he walked me home that night, he handed me something before he said goodbye, a small, painted carousel horse he'd found on the platform. "For your collection," he said, "of cursed things. It sits on my bookshelf now, next to the snow globe and the haunted paperback." Have you ever had a moment on a date where the world felt like a story someone wrote just for you? Let's start a new story. I was standing in line at a cafe the other day, waiting for my oat milk latte, because that's who I am now, when I noticed a guy in front of me talking to his smartwatch. Not on a call, mind you. He was dictating his to-do list to it like he was updating a particularly nosy personal assistant. "Pick up dry cleaning, book dentist, email Rachel about the quarterly projections," he muttered, completely unfazed. And as I stood there, it occurred to me that we live in a world where everyone is their own boss, but also their own assistant. We've somehow managed to both delegate and micromanage our own lives simultaneously. This thought snowballed into a realization about just how much modern life feels like a never-ending game of make-believe adulthood. Take meal kits, for example. Someone else measures your ingredients, preps half the work, and sends you a recipe so simple it has illustrations. But instead of feeling like we're cheating, we convince ourselves we're chefs. "Look at me," we say, proudly plating seared salmon over couscous. A culinary genius. Never mind that a 7-year-old could have followed the same instructions and produced an identical result. We crave the illusion of mastery without the accompanying mess. And honestly, I kind of love that for us. Then there's the peculiar magic of online reviews. If I'm buying something as mundane as a water bottle, I'll still spend 30 minutes reading other people's thoughts on it. Keeps water cold but slightly too tall for a car cup holder can send me into a spiral of indecision. What's even funnier is how seriously we take these reviews. A stranger with the username WaterEnthusiast42 can influence my purchase more than any expert ever could. And let's not even get started on the way people take pictures of their items, as if I need photographic evidence that their blender really did arrive intact. I've noticed we also have a peculiar way of reinventing boredom now. Once being bored meant staring out the window, maybe doodling in a notebook. Now it means scrolling aimlessly through 3 apps in rotation, desperately hoping one of them will produce something new in the last 5 seconds. Even when nothing changes, we keep going, convinced that the dopamine gods will reward our persistence. It's like we're all rats in a very sophisticated maze, except the cheese is just memes and half-read articles. But the quirks don't stop there. Let's talk about how we've turned notifications into a love language. Just checking it, saw this and thought of you. Did you see the thing about the thing? These little pings are modern-day smoke signals, proof that someone out there is thinking of us. The funniest part is how much nuance we've infused into something as simple as a text. A period at the end of a sentence? Too formal. An exclamation point? Friendly. An ellipsis? Mysterious or passive-aggressive, depending on context. Entire relationships now live and die by how we interpret punctuation. And yet, in the midst of all this digital chaos, I've realized there's something deeply comforting about the rituals we've created. Like how every group chat has that one person who drops memes at 2 a.m., or how Zooming has become a verb that somehow encompasses both work meetings and catching up with friends over wine. These habits might not have existed 10 years ago, but they've become the glue holding our scattered lives together. Even the way we experience time has shifted. There's a collective obsession with the idea of productivity, as if every waking hour must be justified. We make lists, then make apps to track the lists, and then spend time updating those apps with our progress. But then, ironically, we celebrate doing nothing like it's a rare and precious art form. Had a self-care day? We'll say posting a picture of a half-read book next to a cup of tea. It's a strange balance between overachieving and underachieving, and honestly, it feels very on-brand for the 21st century. What I love most, though, is how humanity keeps peeking through all the noise. For every drone delivery or algorithmically curated playlist, there's still someone in a comment section sharing an oddly specific piece of advice, like how to fix a squeaky chair with olive oil. For every curated Instagram photo, there's a candid outtake that someone forgot to delete but keeps reappearing as a blooper reel in their phone. We're ridiculous, but we're real. The best example of this might be our obsession with pets. Thanks to social media, every dog and cat is now a minor celebrity, complete with their own themed captions. People dress their pets in costumes, make voiceovers for their imaginary thoughts, and throw them birthday parties with cakes shaped like bones. But you know what? It's pure joy. In a world that can feel overwhelming and impersonal, nothing grounds us quite like a pug in a cowboy hat. So here's where I land. Modern life is absurd in the best possible way. It's a patchwork quilt of tiny rituals, big leaps forward, and small reminders that we're all just figuring this out as we go. We've invented robots to vacuum our floors, but still haven't figured out how to keep socks from disappearing in the laundry. We can connect with anyone, anywhere, but still get giddy when someone sends us a hand-drawn doodle in the mail. We're ridiculous, resourceful, and wildly entertaining. What about you? What's something in your everyday life that makes you stop and laugh at how far we've come, or how far we've overcomplicated things? Share your favorite little absurdity. I'll be over here, asking my smartwatch to remind me to laugh more often. Let's start a new story. So, I have this thing where I start imagining tiny alternate universes about people I like. It's not just daydreaming about dates or hypothetical "what if we got coffee" scenarios. No, I mean full-blown alternate universes. Like if I like you, my brain quietly spins a dozen parallel realities where we're wildly different versions of ourselves, but somehow, we still find a way to meet. The first time I realized I did this, I was sitting across from a guy I had a massive crush on. Let's call him Alex. We were at a coffee shop, and he was telling me about his job, something tech-y and important that I absolutely didn't understand. But instead of listening like a normal person, my brain decided to spin up a new universe where Alex wasn't a tech guy at all. In this universe, he was a beekeeper, and I worked at a candle shop down the road. We'd meet when he came in looking for a birthday gift for his sister. I'd sell him a honey-scented candle, obviously, and he'd say something witty about how the bees probably wouldn't approve of artificial honey smells. I'd laugh, and we'd fall in love over our shared appreciation of scented things and sustainability. Meanwhile, in the actual coffee shop, Alex was saying something about server infrastructure, and I was nodding like I understood. It's like my brain can't stop drafting alternate us scenarios. One night, when I couldn't sleep, I imagined a universe where Alex and I were rival pirate captains. I pictured us shouting insults across our ships, hurling cannonballs and sarcastic jabs at each other, until one day, his ship sank in a storm, and I had to rescue him. Cue the enemies to lovers arc, complete with dramatic declarations and salty sea air. Another time, I imagined us as astronauts stranded on a desolate moon, fighting over who forgot to pack extra food rations, but secretly falling for each other because of the way we ration hope instead. The universes aren't always romantic, though. Sometimes they're just strange. Once, I imagined Alex as a sentient AI living inside a refrigerator, and I was the quirky inventor who built him. We'd argue about my terrible taste in snacks, but eventually I'd upgrade his programming, and he'd admit he actually liked my choice of pistachio ice cream. Don't ask me why my brain thought this was important. I know this sounds ridiculous. Believe me, I've told myself to stop a million times. But there's something so comforting about it. In a way, it's like testing out all the ways you might collide with someone, finding the soft spots in every version of reality where you'd still matter to each other. But then, there's the downside. When you see too many versions of someone, the real one starts to feel fuzzy. Like in the actual universe where Alex was sitting across from me, sipping his cappuccino, I couldn't figure out what to say. Every clever comment I wanted to make was something alternate me would say in one of those other worlds. Here, In the real world, I just blurted out, "Do you think pirate captains ever got bored?" Alex stared at me for a long second. "I feel like they had plenty to do," he said slowly, like he wasn't sure if I was joking. And just like that, I knew I couldn't tell him about the B-Candle universe, or the pirates, or the moon, or the fridge. I'd like to say this story has a happy ending, but it doesn't. Alex and I went on a few more dates before fizzling out. Not because of anything dramatic, just life. But here's the funny part. I couldn't stop imagining universes about him, even after we stopped talking. For weeks, I kept thinking about Alex, Pirate Alex, Astronaut Alex. In some weird way, they felt more real than the actual guy ever did. And I wondered, is this what I do? Do I fall for the possibilities of people instead of the people themselves? That realization hit hard. I decided to take a break from dating for a while, but the universes didn't stop. I'd meet someone new at the grocery store, on the train, through friends, and my brain would immediately start drafting new realities. I'd picture us as rival magicians trying to out-trick each other, or spies forced to fake a marriage for a mission, or neighbors in a tiny, snowy town where we accidentally swapped Christmas trees and had to work together to untangle the mess. It wasn't until much later, months, maybe years, that I met someone who broke the pattern. His name was Liam, and he didn't fit into any of my imaginary universes. Not because he was boring, but because he was too specific, too real. Liam didn't have the broad strokes charm of Pirate Alex or the cinematic appeal of Astronaut Alex. He was just Liam, the guy who made terrible puns about mushrooms. I'm a fungi, and got way too competitive about trivia nights at the bar. And for the first time in forever, I didn't feel the need to invent alternate versions of him. It was terrifying and kind of beautiful. I still think about those universes sometimes, not because I miss them, but because they remind me of how my brain works, how I love to create, to imagine, to test all the ways I might love someone. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we all do it in our own way. Whether it's imagining different lives with someone or just wondering what they'd look like in a beekeeping suit. So, now it's your turn. Do you ever imagine alternate realities about the people you like? Or have your own way of spinning stories about love before it even begins? If you do, tell me, because honestly, I'd love to know if Pirate Me ever crosses paths with Pirate You. Let's start a new story. The day started with a forgotten umbrella and a drizzle that quickly turned to a downpour. I was stuck under the awning of a thrift store, the kind that seemed to be holding onto its existence by sheer will. The neon sign buzzed faintly, and the window display looked like it had been curated by someone with an affection for chaos. Mismatched china, a dusty accordion, and a mannequin wearing a feather boa and ski goggles. I glanced at my watch. The rain wasn't letting up, and I had nowhere urgent to be. So, I shrugged and pushed the door open, triggering the jangle of an old-fashioned bell. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mothballs and wood polish, the universal scent of forgotten treasures. The aisles were narrow and packed with everything from faded cookbooks to shelves of VHS tapes nobody would ever watch again. There was no logic to the layout. It was the kind of place you had to explore like a maze, letting curiosity guide you. My curiosity led me to a shelf of what looked like broken appliances. Old radios, typewriters missing keys, a toaster with a dent so severe it looked like it had been in a bar fight. And there, sitting inconspicuously between a cracked coffee grinder and a rotary phone, was a small, rectangular object wrapped in faded leather. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, with a brass latch that had grown green with age. A box, maybe? Or a book. I unlatched it carefully, the metal creaking like a hinge on a door that hadn't been opened in years. Inside was a set of cards, thick and yellowed at the edges. They weren't playing cards. They had no numbers or suits, but each one was printed with a single word and an illustration. The first card read Summer in bold letters, accompanied by a drawing of a meadow bathed in sunlight. The second card said Laughter, showing a group of faceless children on a swing set. Each card I flipped through felt like a tiny fragment of something whole, a language I couldn't quite decipher, but understood anyway. Then I pulled a card that made my breath catch. Home. The illustration was a house. Not any house, but my house. Or at least, the one I'd grown up in. The details were unmistakable. The peeling shutters, the way the front steps leaned slightly to one side, the wind chime made from seashells my mom had strung together one summer. I stared at the card, my fingers trembling slightly. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. I flipped to the next card. Taste. The illustration showed a glass of lemonade, complete with beads of condensation on the side. Instantly, I could feel the phantom weight of a glass in my hand and taste the sugary tang of the lemonade my grandmother used to make. Always too sweet, with just a whisper of tartness. I was 8 years old again, sitting on her porch, swinging my legs and listening to her hum a tune I never recognized. I rifled through the cards now, faster, as if the next one might explain what I was holding. Winter, a snow-covered hill where my cousins and I used to sled until our cheeks burned red. Adventure, a creek I hadn't thought about in years, where we spent hours daring each other to cross on the wobbly log bridge. Each card hit me like a tidal wave of memory, sharp and vivid, bypassing the logic centers of my brain and going straight for the heart. And then I reached the last card. It didn't have a word, just an image, a wooden box that looked suspiciously like the one I was holding. But the illustration was different. The box in the picture was open, and the cards were gone. In their place was a single swirling void, dark and full of motion, like ink poured into water. I snapped the lid of the box shut and looked around the store, half expecting someone to pop out and demand it back. But the place was empty except for the clerk, an older man sitting behind the counter, flipping through a magazine with disinterest. "How much for this?" I asked, holding up the box. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, like I'd been crying, though I hadn't shed a tear. He glanced at it, squinting slightly. $5. I paid in cash, shoved the box into my bag, and stepped back into the rain. It had lightened to a mist, but I barely noticed. At home, I sat at my kitchen table, the box in front of me. I thought about opening it again, about flipping through the cards to chase more memories, but something held me back. It felt like I'd been given a gift I didn't quite understand, a glimpse into a past that was both mine and not mine. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening. I'd dream about places I hadn't thought of in years, only to wake up with the smell of them still lingering in my nose. A snippet of music would play in my head, and I'd remember dancing in the living room with my mom, both of us laughing so hard we could barely stand. It was as if the cards had unlocked a part of my brain that had been locked away, filling my life with tiny, bittersweet hauntings. One night, I took the box out again, feeling its weight in my hands. Slowly, I opened it, expecting to see the cards. But the box was empty now, lined with nothing but soft, faded velvet. I didn't feel disappointed. Somehow, I knew it had served its purpose. I still have the box sitting on a shelf in my room. Every now and then, I'll glance at it and feel the faintest tug of something. A memory, a feeling, a whisper of who I used to be. Have you ever stumbled across something that felt like it wasn't just an object, but a doorway? A key to a version of yourself you thought was lost? Let's start a new story. When I opened my eyes, I was sitting at a table in the middle of a bustling cafe. It wasn't just any cafe, though. The walls shimmered faintly, as if they were made of sunlight trapped in water, and the air hummed with a melody that didn't seem to come from anywhere. Or maybe it came from everything. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with something electric, like the air before a storm. There was a menu in front of me, but it wasn't made of paper. It was a sheet of soft light, and the words danced across it, rearranging themselves every time I blinked. The items weren't what you'd expect in a cafe. No cappuccinos or croissants. Instead, the menu listed things like a memory of your favorite laugh, the flavor of a sunset you almost forgot, and the feeling of winning an argument you didn't have to have. "What'll it be?" asked the waiter. I looked up, startled. They were wearing a suit that seemed to shift through every color imaginable, and their face was blurry, like a photograph taken mid-laugh. Their voice was warm, like an old friend teasing you. "I don't know," I said, glancing back at the menu. "What is this place?" The waiter's smile seemed to stretch, even though I couldn't quite see it. "This is the Cafe of Small Eternities," they said. "A place between moments. You got time for one order. Choose wisely." I looked around. The other patrons weren't ordinary people, either. One man had feathers instead of hair, and his drink swirled with liquid starlight. At another table, a woman was sipping from a cup while tears streamed down her face. But she was laughing, her joy so radiant it made my chest ache. Near the corner, a shadow sat alone, holding a glass that seemed to absorb light. I turned back to the menu, overwhelmed. I don't know what to pick. The waiter nodded knowingly. That's common for first-timers. Do you want a recommendation? I hesitated. Sure. They gestured to the menu, and a new option appeared, written in golden script. The answer to a question you forgot to ask. That's a good one, they said, their tone approving. Always a crowd pleaser. What does it mean? I asked. You won't know until you taste it, they said with a wink, or what I thought was a wink. I glanced at the other items. Some tugged at me, like the moment you realized you were loved, or the sound of a choice unmade. But something about the question, about answers, made my heart race. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Okay, I said finally. I'll take that. The waiter clapped their hands, and the menu disappeared. Excellent choice. Coming right up. They glided away, leaving me to fidget in my chair. Around me, the cafe seemed to pulse with energy. I tried to overhear conversations, but the words slipped through my mind like water through cupped hands. Every person here seemed to carry a gravity of their own, and I felt like an intruder, like someone who had stumbled into the wrong dream. When the waiter returned, they were holding a tiny porcelain cup, no bigger than an espresso shot. The liquid inside was deep, almost black, but it shimmered faintly, like it was alive. They set it in front of me with a flourish. There you go, they said. Drink when you're ready. I stared at the cup, my reflection bending in its surface. What happens when I drink it? The waiter's smile flickered, their voice softening. That's entirely up to you. With a deep breath, I picked up the cup. It was warm, like it had been cradled in sunlight. I tilted it to my lips and drank. The taste was indescribable. It wasn't sweet or bitter, hot or cold. It was everything and nothing, like tasting the color of a memory or the sound of silence. And then the world around me shattered. Not violently, but like a curtain being pulled back. Suddenly, I was standing in my childhood bedroom. The air smelled of crayons and dust, and sunlight streamed through the window in that golden way it does in late afternoons. I was holding a small, broken toy, a spaceship I'd loved fiercely as a kid. And across from me stood someone I didn't recognize. They looked like me, or maybe like what I might have been or could still be. Their eyes were steady, and they smiled faintly, like they knew me better than I knew myself. What's happening? I asked. You asked for the answer to a question, they said. And here it is. Why do you keep looking back? I stared at them, confused. What do you mean? You keep carrying pieces of your past, they said gently. Regrets. What ifs. You let them weigh you down, like you're afraid to leave them behind. But you don't have to. I felt my chest tighten. But what if I need them? What if they're part of me? They agreed. But they don't define you. You can remember them without letting them hold you. I looked at the broken spaceship in my hands. The weight of it suddenly unbearable. How do I let go? They stepped closer and placed a hand on mine. By understanding that letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means making room for what comes next. The spaceship crumbled into light, dissolving into nothing. And with it, the room faded too, the walls melting into the golden glow of the cafe. I was back in my chair, the tiny porcelain cup empty in front of me. The waiter was watching me, their blurry face unreadable. Good, they asked. I nodded, my throat tight. Yeah, I think so. They smiled. One more thing, they said, holding out their hand. The bill. I blinked. The bill? Nothing's free. Not even here, they said lightly. I reached into my pocket, unsure of what I'd find, but instead of money, I pulled out a fragment of something. A memory, sharp and clear. It was the first time I'd failed at something important, the shame of it still raw after all these years. The waiter took it gently, tucking it into their pocket. Good trade, they said. Enjoy the rest of your eternity. Before I could respond, the cafe began to dissolve around me. its walls fading like the tail end of a dream. I woke up in my bed, the morning sun streaming through my window. But something felt lighter, freer. If you could visit the cafe of small eternities, what would you order? And what would you leave behind? Let's start a new story. It started with a noise, a faint hum that barely registered over the usual chaos of the city. At first, I thought it was coming from the air vents in my building, a kind of low, droning vibration that you feel more than hear. But it followed me down the block into the subway, even inside the cafe, where I stopped to drown my fatigue in coffee strong enough to melt steel. By the time I got home, the hum had nestled into my brain, threading through my thoughts like a needle-pulling thread. It wasn't loud or grating, but constant, insistent. And as I turned the key to my apartment, I realized it wasn't just sound. It had weight. The air felt heavier, charged, as if I'd walked into a thunderstorm that hadn't yet broken. I dropped my bag, half expecting to see something, anything, that would explain the sensation. But the apartment looked the same as it always did. Cluttered, dimly lit, faintly smelling of takeout, and candles burned too long. It was only when I passed the bookshelf that I saw it. A door. Not a literal door, but the unmistakable outline of one. A faint shimmer at the back of the shelf, where my copy of The Catcher in the Rye should have been. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I reached out, slowly, my fingertips brushing the shimmer. It rippled under my touch, warm and alive like the surface of a sunlit pond. Before I could think better of it, I pushed. The bookshelf wasn't supposed to move. It was heavy, filled to the brim with books and knickknacks I'd collected over the years. But it swung open like it was on greased hinges, revealing a narrow passageway that shouldn't have existed. The walls were lined with wooden planks, worn smooth, and the air inside smelled of earth and something older, deeper, like the air in a cave. The hum was louder now, pulsing in sync with my heartbeat. I should have been terrified, but there was something almost familiar about it, like a melody I'd forgotten how to hum. I stepped inside. The passage wasn't long, just a few steps before it opened into a room that defied logic. It was circular, with walls made of dark, polished stone that glimmered faintly in the dim light. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested an object that made the air in my lungs turn to lead. It was a globe, but not like any I'd ever seen. The surface was glass, smooth and flawless, but instead of continents, it was filled with swirling light, soft blues and golds that shifted and danced as if alive. And in the center of the light, suspended in impossible stillness, was a single thread. The hum was coming from the globe. I didn't understand how I knew, but I did. Just like I knew, instinctively, that the thread was connected to me. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached out. The moment my fingertips grazed the glass, the world fell away. I was 6 years old, standing in the backyard of my childhood home. The sun was high and bright, the grass cool and damp beneath my bare feet. My dad was there, his laughter echoing as he held my little brother upside down by the ankles, both of them cackling like madmen. My mom was on the porch, snapping pictures with the bulky old camera she always carried, her smile wide and unguarded. It was so vivid, so alive, that I forgot it wasn't real. I could feel the sun warming my skin, smell the faint metallic tang of the sprinkler water spraying the hydrangeas. I ran toward my dad, my heart light with the kind of joy you only feel when the world is still new and whole. Then the memory shifted. I was a teenager now, sitting in the passenger seat of my best friend's beat-up car. The radio was blasting some emo anthem we thought was profound, and the windows were rolled down, the wind tangling my hair into a mess I wouldn't bother fixing. We were driving nowhere, just letting the road stretch out ahead of us, endless and full of promise. She turned to me, laughing at something I'd said, and for a moment, I thought I could stay there forever. But the globe had other plans. The memories came faster now, tumbling over each other in a chaotic rush. The first time I rode a bike without training wheels, the time I got caught sneaking out and grounded for a month, the moment I got my first acceptance letter and screamed so loudly my neighbors complained. Each one was so sharp, so whole, that it hurt to leave them behind, but I had no choice. The thread kept pulling, Finally, I landed somewhere dark and quiet. My college dorm room, late at night, the glow of my laptop, the only light. I was crying, my chest tight with an ache I couldn't explain. The weight of the world felt unbearable, but I kept typing anyway, pouring my heart into an email I'd never send, a confession of fears I couldn't say out loud. I wanted to reach out to myself, to say, "You're going to be okay. This isn't forever." But the memory didn't care. It moved on. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the stone room. The globe sat on the pedestal, its light dimmer now, the thread inside trembling faintly. My hand was still on the glass, but I didn't pull it away. I couldn't. The hum was quieter now, almost tender, and I realized it wasn't just sound. It was a question. Do you want to go back? I hesitated. The memories had been beautiful, but they weren't real. Not anymore. They were threads in a tapestry that had already been woven, no more tangible than the light in the globe. But the pull was strong, so strong. I thought of my dad's laughter, my mom's smile, the endless road ahead of my best friend and me. I thought of the weight of that night in the dorm room and how much I wanted to rewrite it. But then I thought of now, of the life I was still living, the threads I hadn't yet pulled. I let go. The hum stopped. The globe dimmed. And as I stepped back through the passageway and into my apartment, the air felt lighter. The world outside was still the same, messy, chaotic, and perfect. But it was mine. The door behind the bookshelf never reappeared. Sometimes I wonder if it was ever really there at all. But I don't need it anymore. I've learned to carry my threads with me, woven into every moment, every breath. So I ask you, if you could follow a thread to any part of your past, would you? Or would you leave it where it belongs? Let's start a new story. There's a little coffee shop tucked between a dry cleaner and a hardware store that I visit sometimes when I need to think. It's nothing special. Wobbly tables, mismatched chairs, and a chalkboard menu that's always smudged with ghostly remnants of yesterday's specials. But the thing that keeps me coming back isn't the coffee, which is mediocre at best, or the atmosphere, which is more forgotten storage closet than cozy nook. It's the old upright piano shoved against the back wall. The piano's battered beyond belief, with peeling wood veneer and keys that stick if you press them wrong. There's a hand-drawn sign taped to it that says, "Play ME," as if the piano's begging for attention, and on most days, people oblige. Sometimes it's kids plunking out chopsticks with sticky fingers while their parents try not to wince. Other times it's amateur pianists with too much confidence and too little rhythm. But every now and then, something magical happens. I was there last Thursday, nursing a lukewarm latte and scrolling aimlessly through my phone when a man sat down at the piano. He was middle-aged, wearing a faded flannel shirt and the kind of expression you only see on people who've just remembered they left the oven on at home. He ran his fingers over the keys experimentally, wincing at the ones that clunked instead of sang. Then, without a word or glance to anyone, he started to play. At first, it was tentative, a halting melody that seemed to apologize for existing. But as he played, something shifted. His hands found their confidence, and the music blossomed into something rich and full, like sunlight pouring into a dusty room. It wasn't a song I recognized. If it had words, they would have been in a language I didn't understand, but it carried this aching kind of beauty that made you feel like you were eavesdropping on someone's memories. The coffee shop fell silent. Even the barista, who usually slammed the milk steamer around like it owed her money, stopped to watch. A couple at the corner table put down their forks mid-bite, their pancakes forgotten. The whole room seemed to lean in, drawn to this stranger and his music. When he finished, he sat there for a moment, his hands still resting on the keys. Then he stood up, nodded to no one in particular, and walked out. The spell broke, and the shop buzzed back to life. But something lingered in the air, like the echo of a bell. I couldn't stop thinking about him for the rest of the day. Who was he? What had brought him to that coffee shop, to that piano? And why did it feel like he'd just cracked the world open a little, letting something spill out that didn't quite belong here? The next time I went to the shop, the piano was quiet again, but something else caught my attention. There was a notebook sitting on one of the tables by the window, the kind of spiral-bound thing you'd pick up at a drugstore. On the cover, someone had written, "Leave a piece of yourself." Curious, I opened it. Inside, The pages were filled with stories, doodles, and notes from strangers. One page had a sketch of the coffee shop, complete with tiny stick-figure baristas. Another had a poem scrawled in messy handwriting. I came here because I was tired of being seen / but your smile made me glad to exist. There were jokes, drawings of cats, even a recipe for banana bread written like a love letter. Flipping through it felt like reading a secret history of the shop. It was all so ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. This patchwork of lives stitched together in a spiral notebook. I added my own piece, a quick sketch of the piano and a few words about the man who played it, and left the notebook where I found it. Since then, I've been thinking a lot about the quiet ways people leave pieces of themselves behind. Not the big, flashy acts of creativity or courage, but the little things. A melody played on a piano no one cares about. A joke scribbled in the margins of a notebook. A kind word left for a stranger to find. It reminds me of something else I saw once, years ago. I was walking through a forest after a rainstorm. The kind of damp, misty morning where the world feels soft and blurry around the edges. On a tree by the path, someone had carved the words, "Be gentle." That was it. No initials, no explanation, just a quiet plea etched into the bark. I don't know who left it there or why, but it's stuck with me ever since. I think about those words whenever I stumble across something like the notebook or the piano. It's like the universe is full of tiny messages, left behind by people who couldn't know who'd find them, but hoped, somehow, that they'd matter. And they do. They remind us that we're connected, even in the smallest, strangest ways. So now I'm curious. Have you ever found something like that? A note, a song, a moment that made you pause and think, who left this here for me? Or better yet, have you ever left something behind for someone else to find? Let's start a new story. It began, as most things do in high school, with an accident that spiraled completely out of control. A busted vending machine. One of those clunky old monsters they kept in the teacher's lounge, filled with sodas and snacks nobody liked. On a normal day, its faint hum and clatter wouldn't draw anyone's attention. But on this day, it wasn't the machine's contents that caught our interest. It was what lay behind it. Jamie had been dared to sneak into the teacher's lounge after hours and grab the principal's stash of peppermint tea. It was a ridiculous heist, the kind you only attempt when you're 17 and invincible. But when Jamie nudged the vending machine to slip behind it, the thing tipped ever so slightly, revealing a sliver of space between it and the wall. And in that space, a door. It wasn't just any door. This thing looked ancient, painted in peeling layers of navy blue, with a brass handle that had tarnished to a dull green. Most importantly, it had no business being there. The teacher's lounge backed into a concrete utility wall. The school's blueprints were clear about that. There wasn't supposed to be anything behind it. Jamie came running to tell the rest of us. By the rest, I mean our usual band of misfits, me, Sasha, and Keenan. We were the ones who always stayed late, hanging out in the empty band room or under the bleachers, just waiting for life to throw something interesting our way. And here it was, interesting, mysterious, and probably illegal. We couldn't resist. We waited until the school emptied out and then slipped back into the lounge. It wasn't hard to move the vending machine. Sasha's boyfriend worked out, and she knew exactly how to leverage a dolly to tilt it just enough. The door stood there, humming faintly, as if daring us to open it. "What do you think is inside?" Jamie whispered. "Probably just a storage closet," Keenan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Only one way to find out," Sasha said, gripping the handle. It turned easily, and the door swung inward without a sound. The room beyond was dark, the air thick with the smell of paper and something metallic. I flicked on my phone's flashlight, and the beam revealed walls lined with filing cabinets. Row after row of them, stretching impossibly far. Farther than the length of the teacher's lounge. Farther than the entire school should have allowed. "What the hell?" I murmured. Sasha stepped inside first, her light cutting through the darkness. "Is this a filing archive?" she asked, running her fingers over the labels on one cabinet. The tabs were marked with what looked like names, dates, and phrases like event documentation or behavioral note, severity level. Keenan opened one drawer and pulled out a folder. "This one has my name on it." We all froze. What do you mean? Jamie asked, his voice cracking. Keenan held up the folder. Sure enough, his name was scrawled across the top in bold black ink. He opened it slowly, pulling out a stack of papers. The first page was a detailed transcript of the time he'd gotten into a fight with his stepbrother at the bus stop. The second page described the time he broke his wrist skateboarding and lied about how it happened. The details were disturbingly accurate, right down to things he hadn't told anyone. This is insane, Keenan said, flipping through more pages. How do they know all this? Jamie found a drawer with his name on it and yanked it open. The rest of us followed suit, digging through folders with our names, our friends' names, even teachers' names. Each file was meticulously detailed, documenting not just the big stuff, grades, disciplinary actions, but the small, private things. Sasha's folder included notes about the time she stole her mom's car and drove to the next town. Mine had a transcript of a conversation I'd had in my bedroom when I was home alone, ranting to no one in particular. This is impossible, I whispered. How could they know this? The further we looked, the weirder it got. There were notes predicting our behaviors, like warnings in advance of things we hadn't even done yet. Sasha found a page that said she'd skip her college entrance exams in May, a thought she'd barely even considered. Jamie's file said he'd start a fire in the school lab, which he swore he'd never do. These are guesses, Keenan said, though he didn't sound convinced. They're just wrong predictions. Are they? Sasha asked, holding up a sheet that perfectly described an argument she'd had with her dad last week, down to the exact words she'd screamed. Because this sure as hell isn't. As we flipped through, we found folders labeled with names we didn't recognize. Students who'd graduated decades ago. Teachers who no longer worked here. And then, in a drawer near the back, one labeled future subjects. Inside were empty files, their tabs already marked with names. The names of incoming freshmen who hadn't even stepped foot in the building yet. I don't like this, Jamie said, backing away. I don't like this at all. Who made this? I asked. Why does it exist? Sasha pulled open another drawer, this one marked with a single word, anomalies. Inside were folders with headings like unresolved cases and behavioral deviations. One tab caught my eye, containment protocols. I opened it and read the first page. My stomach turned to ice. It wasn't just about monitoring us. It was about controlling us. Notes on how to manipulate behaviors, how to isolate students who didn't fit patterns. There were pages detailing corrective interventions for people who stepped too far out of line. I think we need to leave, I said, shoving the folder back in place. But when we turned toward the door, it wasn't there anymore. The room stretched endlessly in every direction, the cabinets multiplying, the walls disappearing into darkness. Our flashlights began to flicker, and somewhere in the distance, we heard the faint sound of metal drawers opening and slamming shut. What's happening? Jamie whispered, his voice shaking. Nobody answered. We ran, the beam of my phone bobbing wildly as the air around us seemed to close in. The cabinets blurred together, and the room felt like it was shifting, tilting, swallowing us whole. Eventually, we stumbled into the light of the vending machine. The door behind us slammed shut, and the machine fell back into place as if it had never moved. We didn't talk about what happened that night. Not at first, but we all knew one thing. The school was watching us, had always been watching, and somewhere in that endless archive, our futures were already written. Let's start a new story. The moment it happened, I was in the laundromat, watching socks and t-shirts spin themselves dizzy behind the grimy glass of a dryer. The room hummed with fluorescent light and the rhythmic churn of machines, the smell of detergent thick in the air. I hadn't planned to be there. The washing machine in my apartment had gone on strike again, and I'd lugged my laundry basket down the block, grumbling all the way. It was just another errand, a box to tick off the day's to-do list. And then, in the middle of it all, the vending machine hiccuped. I wasn't even using it. I was sitting on one of those plastic chairs bolted to the floor, flipping idly through my phone, when it happened. The machine, old and battered, let out a mechanical groan and spat something onto the tray. Curious, I got up to check. It wasn't a soda or a snack. It was a bright red plastic capsule, the kind you'd find in the claw machines at a gas station or an arcade. The sight of it hit me like a splash of cold water. For a long moment, I just stared. My fingers hovered over the capsule, hesitant, like touching it might wake up something I wasn't ready for. Eventually, though, curiosity won, and I plucked it from the tray. It was warm, almost as if it had been waiting for me, and when I twisted it open, the contents slid into my palm. Inside was a small, faded ring, a cheap plastic thing with a pink gemstone the size of a peanut. The surface was scratched and the band was slightly warped, but my breath caught the second I saw it. I knew this ring. I wasn't just familiar with it. I knew it the way you know the smell of your childhood bedroom or the sound of your mother calling your name. I could see it in my mind, perfectly whole and new, sitting in a plastic capsule identical to the one I'd just opened. I remembered gripping that capsule in my sticky little hands, twisting it open with the kind of determination only a kid can muster, and pulling out the prize like I'd discovered buried treasure. It was from the boardwalk. I was 10 years old. My parents had taken me there for the weekend, and I'd blown all my quarters on a claw machine shaped like a pirate ship, the prizes tumbling in a sea of blinking lights and jangly music. I'd never won anything before, and when that claw plucked the capsule from the pile and dropped it into the chute, I'd let out a shriek loud enough to make everyone in the arcade turn. My dad had laughed, the sound rich and warm, and he'd given me a high five like I'd just conquered the world. I wore that ring every day that summer. It didn't matter that it was cheap or gaudy or too big for my finger. It was mine, a victory, a memory. And now, here it was in my hand again, as if time had folded in on itself. I stared at it, my thoughts a whirlpool of questions. Could it actually be the same ring? That was impossible, wasn't it? The boardwalk was hundreds of miles away, and decades had passed. I'd lost the ring before the summer ended, and the memory of it had slipped into the fog of childhood where lost toys go. I slid the ring onto my finger. It still didn't fit, of course, too small this time, but something about the weight of it felt right, like I'd been missing it without realizing. I sat back down, the capsule still in my other hand, and watched the dryer spin. My laundry, my chores, the fluorescent hum of the laundromat. All of it faded into the background as the ring pulled me deeper into the memory. I was back at the boardwalk, the air salty and electric with the hum of the arcade games. My dad stood beside me, watching as I tried to win another prize, his arms crossed and his face lit with quiet amusement. The ring sparkled in the light of the claw machine, catching the glint of the sunset through the arcade's open doors. For a moment, everything felt big and bright and full of possibility. Then the memory shifted. I wasn't at the boardwalk anymore. I was at the kitchen table a week later crying. The ring was gone, lost somewhere in the sand or the carnival rides. My dad had knelt beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder. Sometimes, he'd said softly, the things we lose find a way back to us. You just have to give them time. I'd forgotten he'd said that. Until now, the dryer buzzed, jolting me back to the present. My laundry was done. The laundromat was just a laundromat again, full of tired people and half-empty detergent bottles. But my hand was still curled around the ring, its tiny gemstone glinting in the harsh light. I didn't care how or why it had found me. I just knew it had, and that felt like enough. As I folded my clothes and packed them into my basket, the ring stayed on my finger, a quiet reminder that maybe some things don't stay lost forever. Maybe the universe has a way of tucking little pieces of us into unexpected corners, waiting for the right moment to give them back. What about you? Have you ever stumbled across something that felt impossible? Something that made you wonder if the world might be more connected than we think? Let's start a new story. It started with the envelope, a plain manila thing that showed up in my mailbox one Tuesday afternoon. No return address, no postage, just my name written in neat block letters. I probably should have been suspicious, but honestly, I was more curious than anything else. That curiosity only grew when I opened it and found a single sheet of paper with 3 words written in the center. Find the door. Now, you're probably thinking this is the part where I say I shrugged it off, tossed it in the trash, and moved on with my life. But that's not what happened, because attached to the paper was a tiny brass key. The kind that looks like it belongs to an antique jewelry box or maybe a secret passage in a mansion. It was warm to the touch, which was odd because the weather was freezing that day. And as soon as I held it, I felt something. Not a physical sensation, exactly, but a pull like the key wanted to go somewhere. And it was up to me to figure out where. I spent the rest of the day thinking about it, turning the key over in my hands while trying to make sense of the note. Was it a prank? A mistake? A very specific marketing stunt for an escape room? I didn't have answers, but I couldn't let it go. By evening, the key felt heavier, and the pull was stronger. It wasn't until I was brushing my teeth that I noticed the first clue. My bathroom mirror, fogged up from the steam, had a faint shape in one corner, an outline of a door. I blinked, rubbed at the glass, and watched the shape disappear. But when I stepped back, there it was again, faint but unmistakable. I pressed my hand against the mirror, half expecting it to vanish, but instead, I felt a vibration, like the hum of a distant engine. That's when I knew the key had brought me here for a reason. The door didn't open right away. I spent the next half hour experimenting, turning the key in midair, holding it up to the mirror, whispering "Open sesame" like an idiot. Nothing worked, and I was about to give up when I noticed a tiny keyhole etched into the corner of the mirror, so small I'd missed it before. I inserted the key, turned it, and the vibration grew louder until the mirror shimmered, rippled, and became a door. A real, solid door, with an iron handle and peeling red paint. My bathroom was gone, replaced by a dark hallway that stretched into the unknown. My heart was racing, and every rational part of me was screaming to stop. But the pull was stronger, so I stepped through. The hallway wasn't long, but it felt endless. The air was thick like walking through a dream, and the walls were lined with shelves full of objects. An old pocket watch ticking backward, a pair of glasses that fogged up even though no one was wearing them, a jar of something that looked suspiciously alive. None of it made sense, but then again, neither did the door. At the end of the hallway was another door, identical to the first. This time I didn't hesitate. I turned the handle and stepped through. I don't know how to describe what I found on the other side, because even now, I'm not sure it was real. It was a room, or maybe a clearing, bathed in golden light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The air was warm, and the ground was soft, like moss but not quite. In the center of the space was a tree, impossibly large, with branches that stretched up and out so far they seemed to disappear. Hanging from its branches were keys. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them, all sizes and shapes, each one swaying gently as if moved by an invisible wind. I stood there, staring, until a voice broke the silence. "You're late." I turned, and there was a man sitting cross-legged at the base of the tree, his face half hidden by the shadows of the branches. He was holding a book, its pages glowing faintly as he turned them. "Late for what?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I'd like to admit. "For your story," he said simply. Then he closed the book, stood, and gestured toward the tree. "Choose." "Choose what?" "A key," he said. "They're not all yours. But one is. The right one will take you forward. The wrong one," he didn't finish the sentence, but the way he smiled, like he knew something I didn't, made my stomach drop. I wanted to ask more questions, but the pull I'd felt since I first held the key was stronger now, guiding me toward the tree. My feet moved on their own, and before I knew it, I was standing beneath the branches, staring at the keys. They chimed softly as they swayed, each one a melody that was just out of reach. And then I saw it, a key, identical to the one that had brought me here, but glowing faintly, almost imperceptibly. I reached for it, half expecting something to stop me, but nothing did. The moment my fingers closed around the key, the light shifted, the air trembled, and the tree, it was gone. The man was gone. The room was gone. I was back in my bathroom, holding the second key in one hand and the original note in the other. Except now, the note had changed. The words "find the door" had been replaced with something else. This is only the beginning. I don't know what it means or what I'm supposed to do next. But the key still hums in my hand, and every mirror in my house has started showing faint outlines, door-shaped and waiting. So, here's my question. What would you do if a door like this appeared in your life? Would you open it? Or would you walk away? Because I have a feeling this isn't the kind of thing you can ignore for long. Let's start a new story. I I didn't mean to start narrating my life like a nature documentary. It just kind of happened. I was sitting on my couch, eating cereal straight from the box, as one does, when I dropped a Cheerio. It landed perfectly in the small crease between the cushions. A little cereal moon orbiting the vast galaxy of my increasingly chaotic living room. Without thinking, I said out loud, in my best David Attenborough voice, "And here we see the solitary Cheerio, stranded in the wild, its future uncertain." That should have been the end of it. A silly moment to laugh at before getting on with my day. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't stop seeing life that way. Every little thing in my apartment suddenly becoming a grand survival tale or an ecosystem in miniature. My drying rack became a bustling rainforest of damp fabrics, struggling to regain their former glory. My fridge was a frozen tundra where expired yogurt bravely coexists with forgotten leftovers. Even my phone charger, coiled haphazardly on the floor, was rebranded as the elusive electronic serpent, forever entangled in its own mysteries. The problem wasn't that I was narrating everything. The problem was that I couldn't stop. A few days later, I was at a coffee shop when I caught myself mentally describing the scene in vivid detail. The human herd gathers near the counter, exchanging offerings of currency for caffeine, their lifeblood. I almost laughed out loud, but the barista handed me my coffee just in time, and I had to play it cool. I left the shop in a haze, sipping my latte like it was some kind of profound elixir. By then, it wasn't just a joke anymore. It was a habit. And the thing about habits is, they find ways to stick around. At first, it felt harmless, fun even. Who wouldn't want to turn the mundane into a private little game of imagination? But then things started getting weirder. Like the time I was walking home and noticed a crumpled takeout menu on the ground. I paused, staring at it as if it were an ancient artifact, abandoned by its creators. I thought, the flyer flutters against the asphalt, waiting for the wind to dictate its fate. A jogger passed by, clearly noticing my 1,000-yard stare, and I scrambled to keep walking, embarrassed. By the time I found myself philosophizing about a ketchup packet stuck under a bus bench, asterisk, its potential forever unrealized, a tragedy in 3 ounces. Asterisk, I knew I might need help. But who do you even talk to about this? A therapist? A creative writing professor? The ghost of Jacques Cousteau? I decided to just ride it out, hoping my brain would eventually tire of this strange new lens. Spoiler, it didn't. What surprised me, though, was how much joy it brought me. For all its ridiculousness, the narration turned the everyday into something extraordinary. My morning coffee wasn't just coffee. It was the sacred brew of dawn, coaxing its drinker into wakefulness. My commute wasn't just a boring slog. It was a pilgrimage through the concrete jungle, fraught with traffic and questionable radio ads. Even waiting for the elevator became a mini-drama. The metallic beast slumbers, its doors sealed, until summoned by the press of a button. Somewhere along the way, this running commentary became less about humor and more about noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way sunlight reflected off the neighbor's car windshield, painting fleeting patterns on the pavement. The soft creak of the floorboards as I tiptoed to the kitchen at midnight, feeling like I was sneaking through the corridors of a haunted castle. Life felt more vivid, more alive, because I was paying attention to the details in a way I never had before. And it wasn't just me. People started noticing, too, my friends especially. One day, I was walking with my best friend when she pointed out a pigeon perched on a lamppost. Without missing a beat, I muttered, "The noble urban scavenger surveys its domain, unbothered by the chaos below." She stopped mid-step and stared at me. "What did you just say?" she asked, grinning. I shrugged, pretending it was no big deal, but she wouldn't let it go. From then on, it became a game between us. She'd point at something random, a leaf floating in a puddle, a half-eaten bagel abandoned on a park bench, and wait for me to narrate its story. "Do the bagel," she'd say, and I'd respond. Once destined for greatness, the bagel now rests in obscurity, its destiny consumed, quite literally, by an unknown foe. She'd laugh so hard she couldn't breathe, and for a few minutes, the world felt lighter. It's strange, isn't it? How something so small, so silly, can shift the way you see the world. I used to think of the mundane as exactly that, mundane. Background noise to be ignored, filler between the real moments of life. But somewhere between the Cheerio and the bagel, I realized there's no such thing as a meaningless detail. Everything has a story if you look closely enough. Even the tiniest, most inconsequential thing can carry a spark of magic if you're willing to imagine it. These days, I don't narrate quite as often. The habit hasn't gone away entirely. It's more like a quiet companion that pops up now and then, unprompted. Sometimes I'll be walking down the street and spot a plastic bag caught in a tree branch, flapping in the wind. Without thinking, I'll hear the words in my head, a relic of human industry, now at the mercy of nature's whims. I'll smile to myself, shake my head, and keep walking, grateful for the little spark of wonder that, for a moment, made the world feel a little bigger. So, what about you? What's the last small, silly thing that... Let's start a new story. Not a loud, attention-seeking whistle, just a soft, tuneless sound she'd make under her breath when she was nervous or thinking. The kind of sound you might mistake for the breeze slipping through a crack in the window. The first time I noticed it, we were in the car, stuck in traffic, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel. She was staring ahead, whistling so quietly I wasn't even sure if she knew she was doing it. "What's that song?" I asked. She blinked, startled. "What song?" "The one you're whistling." She tilted her head, confused, before laughing. "I don't think it's a song, just noise." But it wasn't just noise. There was something oddly soothing about it, like a thread weaving through the air, stitching the moment together. The next time I heard it, we were unpacking boxes in our new apartment. The place smelled like fresh paint and cardboard, and the chaos of half-open boxes made me feel like we were squatting in someone else's life. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by books, whistling as she arranged them in piles. Without thinking, I picked up a book and started to hum along. She stopped, looking at me with raised eyebrows. "Are we harmonizing?" I shrugged, trying to look casual. "Maybe." From then on, it became a thing. Whenever she whistled, I'd hum along, and slowly, the nonsensical sounds would morph into something resembling a melody. It wasn't planned or rehearsed. It just happened like our own strange language. One night, we were out walking. The city was unusually quiet, the streets slick from a light rain, everything glinting like it had been dipped in silver. She started whistling again, that same soft, wandering tune, and I couldn't help but join in. Before I realized what was happening, she grabbed my hand and spun me around, right there on the sidewalk. "What are you doing?" I asked, laughing as she tried to dip me, and almost lost her balance. "Making music," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. After that, we started calling it our invisible song. It didn't have words or a proper tune, but it was ours, something that lived between us, like a secret nobody else could hear. It showed up in the strangest places. When we were grocery shopping and she couldn't decide between two brands of cereal, she'd whistle, and I'd hum dramatically like we were scoring a movie. When we fought, which wasn't often, but when it happened, it was sharp and quiet. One of us would break the silence by whistling, tentatively like a white flag. Without fail, the other would hum back, and whatever wall had sprung up between us would crumble. But the best moments were the unexpected ones. Like the time we got caught in a torrential downpour on the way back from the park, drenched and laughing as we ran for cover. She started whistling just to make me laugh, and I hummed so loudly the people sheltering under the bus stop stared. Or the night we lost power, and she lit a candle, whistling softly as the flame danced in her eyes, pulling me in her orbit like she always did. The invisible song wasn't always there. Life had its way of filling the spaces between us with noise, work deadlines, broken appliances, bills. But it never disappeared completely. Sometimes weeks would pass without a note, and then one of us would whistle out of nowhere like calling a bird back to its nest. One day, long after we'd moved to a new city and filled our lives with new routines, she started whistling a new tune. It was slower, more deliberate, like a lullaby. "That's different," I said, catching the sound as it floated through the apartment. She smiled, her hand resting on her belly. "I think it's time for a new song." When our daughter was born, the invisible song became a trio. She whistled, I hummed, and our baby cooed along, her tiny voice adding an unpredictable layer to the melody. As she grew older, she started whistling too, her notes wild and chaotic, making us laugh so hard we couldn't keep up. Years later, when our daughter left for college, the house felt impossibly quiet. I remember sitting in the kitchen, staring at her empty chair, when I heard the faintest whistle. I turned to see her, my partner in this strange symphony, her lips barely moving, her eyes crinkled with the weight of both joy and longing. I hummed back, our invisible song threading its way through the stillness, filling it with all the love we'd built. Even now, whenever I hear someone whistle, I find myself listening closely, searching for a note that feels familiar. And when I hum back, just softly, just to myself, it feels like she's still there, harmonizing with me in the quiet corners of the world. What about you? What invisible songs tie your lives together? Let's start a new story. It started with a flyer taped to a lamppost, fluttering stubbornly in the wind. I wasn't even supposed to be walking that route. My usual shortcut through the park was blocked off for construction, forcing me to trudge along the city's less scenic detours. The flyer was neon yellow and almost offensively bold in its lettering. Missing snake. Reward offered. Friendly, but scared. Below the words was a blurry photo of what looked like a ball python curled around someone's wrist, and a number to call if found. I stopped in my tracks. Missing snake? How did a snake even go missing in a city like this? Was it out there somewhere, slithering its way through alleyways and under dumpsters? The absurdity of it made me laugh out loud, earning a suspicious glance from a man walking his terrier. I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture of the flyer, fully intending to send it to my roommate with the caption, "This is why I don't trust Craigslist pet ads." But before I could move on, someone behind me said, "You're not thinking of looking for it, are you?" I turned to see a man holding a bag of groceries, one hand cradling a baguette like it was a newborn. He had dark, curly hair that looked like it hadn't been brushed in days, and a pair of glasses that were slightly crooked on his nose. His expression was a mix of amusement and mild concern, like he couldn't decide if I was crazy or just eccentric. "Not exactly," I said, tucking my phone back into my pocket, "but I am curious about how a snake manages to go missing." He gestured toward the flyer with the baguette, as if it were a pointer in a classroom lecture. Probably the same way people lose their cats or dogs. Someone left a window open. Maybe it wanted to explore. Explore? A snake? I arched an eyebrow. Do they even have the capacity for wanderlust? You'd be surprised, he said. Snakes are sneaky. They're like introverts at a party, always looking for the quietest corner to hide in. I laughed despite myself. That's a very specific analogy. He shrugged. What can I say? I grew up with snakes. My sister had a boa named Clementine. Absolute diva. Diva? I echoed. Oh yeah, he said, shifting the grocery bag to his other arm. Clementine refused to eat if anyone but my sister was watching. She'd just stare at us like, "How dare you witness my vulnerable moments?" I was about to respond when a gust of wind tugged the flyer free from its tape, sending it cartwheeling down the sidewalk. Instinctively, we both moved to grab it, our hands colliding midair. His fingers were warm, his grip firm, but not overbearing. For a split second, we froze, staring at each other like two characters in a rom-com who'd accidentally reached for the same coffee cup. "Sorry," he said, letting go first. "No worries." I handed him the flyer, suddenly aware of how ridiculous this must look. Two strangers chasing down a missing snake notice like it was some sacred artifact. "You know," he said, studying the paper, "if you were curious, I wouldn't mind helping you look. I've got a free afternoon." I blinked. "You want to hunt for a snake? Why not? Could be fun." He grinned, the kind of grin that made you feel like you were already in on some secret joke. Besides, how many people can say they've spent their Tuesday chasing a python through the city? There were at least a dozen reasons to say no. I didn't know this guy. I had errands to run. The odds of actually finding the snake were laughably slim. And yet, something about his easy confidence made it hard to resist. Maybe it was the way he talked about Clementine, or the fact that he'd made me laugh on a day I'd expected nothing but monotony. "All right," I said, surprising myself. "But if we don't find it in an hour, I'm calling it quits." "Deal." He tucked the flyer into his pocket and extended his free hand. "I'm Jonah, by the way." "Sophie," I said, shaking it. And just like that, we were off. We combed the area around the lamppost first, peering under parked cars and around trash bins. Jonah narrated each spot we searched like he was hosting a wildlife documentary. Here we see the elusive urban snake, possibly taking refuge beneath a rusty Honda. Note its preference for mid-size sedans. I snorted. "You're really committed to the bit, huh?" "Life's more interesting when you commit to the bit," he said with a wink. Eventually, we ended up in a small park tucked between two apartment buildings. It was mostly empty except for a woman reading on a bench and a pair of kids playing tag. Jonah crouched near a cluster of bushes, poking gently with a stick. "Snakes like warmth," he said. "They'll gravitate towards sunny spots or—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening. "Sophie, come here." I hurried over, half expecting him to pull out a shoe or a piece of trash. But there it was, a small, brown and cream patterned snake coiled up on a patch of grass, looking oddly serene for a creature that had allegedly been lost and scared. "No way," I whispered. "Told you I was good with snakes," Jonah said, carefully scooping the snake up with both hands. It flicked its tongue lazily, as if unimpressed by the fuss. "Now what?" I asked. He held up the flyer. "We call the number, obviously. Return the little adventurer to their rightful owner." As Jonah dialed, I couldn't help but marvel at how surreal the day had turned out. A missing snake, a chance encounter, and a stranger who somehow felt like an old friend. I didn't know where the story would go from there, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I didn't need to know. Some connections, like some snakes, just appeared out of nowhere. All you had to do was not let them slip away. Let's start a new story. The first thing I noticed about the new house was the absence of sound. I don't mean it was quiet. Quiet as the hum of a refrigerator, the distant trill of birds outside. This was silence, deep and heavy, the kind that swallowed everything whole. Even my footsteps on the hardwood floor seemed muffled, as though the house itself didn't want to be disturbed. I'd found the place online, a rental listing with blurry photos and a price so low it felt like a scam. But I needed somewhere to go, and quickly. My lease was up, my savings were thin, and this house, nestled at the edge of a forest I'd never heard of, seemed like a strange kind of salvation. The landlord, a thin, nervous man with darting eyes, had handed me the keys without much conversation. "No pets," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, after a pause, he added, "And keep the windows closed at night." It was an odd thing to say, but I didn't ask questions. It was cheap, it was available, and I didn't plan on staying long. The first few days passed uneventfully. The house was small but functional. A kitchen with outdated appliances, a living room with a single threadbare couch, and a bedroom with a bed frame I had to assemble myself. The forest loomed at the back of the property, dense and dark, its shadows stretching long across the yard as the sun set each evening. I kept the windows closed. It wasn't until the fourth night that I realized something was wrong. I woke around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place, a faint rustling, like leaves skittering across the floor. Groggy and half-conscious, I stumbled out of bed, expecting to find an open window or a stray animal that had somehow gotten inside. But the windows were shut, the lock secure. The house was empty. The noise stopped as soon as I reached the living room. I stood there in the dark, the silence pressing against my ears, and told myself it was nothing. Houses settle, floors creak. It was an old place, after all. But then it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Each time, the sound grew louder. By the end of the week, it wasn't just rustling anymore. There were whispers, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I started leaving the lights on, hoping it would help. It didn't. The voices didn't bother with the pretense of waiting for me to fall asleep anymore. They followed me through the house, growing louder when I turned corners, quieter when I stood still. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They weren't kind. One night, desperate for relief, I broke the landlord's only rule. I opened a window. The forest outside seemed impossibly close, the trees casting jagged shadows across the lawn in the moonlight. The air was cool, damp, and heavy with the scent of moss. For a moment, I stood there, breathing it in, hoping the fresh air would chase the madness away. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line, tall and thin, its body unnaturally still. It was too far away to make out details, but I could feel its eyes on me, heavy and unblinking. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, but the whispers did. They surged around me, louder than ever, hissing and urgent, their words finally taking shape. "Shut the window." I slammed it closed and locked it, my hands trembling. When I looked back, the figure was gone. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I called the landlord. "There's something wrong with this house," I said, pacing the kitchen. He was silent for so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then he spoke, his voice flat and resigned. "You opened the window, didn't you?" I hesitated. "Yes." "Then you need to leave. Now." "What? Why?" "It doesn't matter," he said, his words rushing out like he couldn't get them out fast enough. "Just pack your things and go. Don't stay another night." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, his words ringing in my ears. I should have listened. I should have packed my things, gotten in my car, and left without looking back. But I didn't. That night, the whispers didn't wait for me to fall asleep. They started as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, louder and sharper than ever. The figure returned closer this time. It stood in the middle of the yard, its outline clearer in the moonlight. It wasn't a person. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, its head tilted at an angle that seemed designed to unsettle. It didn't move, but its presence was a weight, pressing against the walls of the house, squeezing the air out of the room. I locked every door and window, my hands shaking. The whispers swirled around me, chaotic and urgent, as though they were trying to drown out the sound of my own heartbeat. Then the lights went out. I backed into a corner, clutching the only thing I could find, a kitchen knife that felt laughably useless. The whispers stopped. The silence returned, deeper and heavier than before. And then, in the dark, I heard it. A single knock at the front door. I didn't move. Another knock, louder this time. The air in the room felt thick, almost solid, as though the house itself was holding its breath. The third knock shook the door in its frame. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran out the back door and into the forest, my bare feet pounding against the cold earth. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't care where I was going. Anything was better than staying in that house. The whispers followed me. When I finally stumbled out of the forest, the sky was just beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon. I never went back for my things. The house still stands, empty and silent, at the edge of the forest. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers, faint and far away, like a warning I didn't heed soon enough. And I know the figure is still there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to open the window. Let's start a new story. The night I met the cartographer, the stars were missing. Not hidden behind clouds, not dimmed by city lights. Just gone. The sky was an unsettling void, an expanse so black it felt like the world had been placed under an overturned bowl. It was the kind of darkness that pressed against your chest and made you feel like something bigger was watching. I was walking home from a late shift, my boots crunching against the gravel of the old trail behind my apartment complex. It wasn't the smartest route at night, but it cut 10 minutes off my walk, and I was too tired to care. My flashlight bobbed with each step, the beam weak, but enough to show me where the trail curved through the woods. Then I saw it, a light ahead, faint but steady, glowing a soft amber. It wasn't the harsh, artificial glare of a street lamp or a passing car. It was warmer, like the glow of a lantern. For reasons I can't explain, I wasn't scared. If anything, I felt drawn to it. I kept walking, my steps slower now, careful. When I rounded the bend, I stopped short. There in the middle of the trail was a desk. A simple wooden desk, old but sturdy, with papers and tools spread across it in a meticulous, almost obsessive arrangement. A brass lantern sat at one corner, its light casting long shadows across a stack of maps. Behind the desk stood a man, or at least something that looked like one. He was tall, too tall, with a lanky frame that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the lantern light. His face was gaunt, sharp angles and hollow cheeks, and his eyes glowed faintly, like embers struggling to stay alive. He wore a dark coat that seemed to ripple like ink spilled in water, and his hands, long, pale, and impossibly steady, moved over the maps with the precision of a surgeon. "You're early," he said, without looking up. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried an unsettling calm, like the stillness before a storm. "Early for what?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly despite my attempt to sound braver than I felt. He looked up then, his amber eyes locking onto mine. "For your map." "My map?" "Yes." He gestured to the desk, where an empty parchment sat waiting. Its edges were lined with intricate symbols I didn't recognize, curving lines and angular shapes that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Beside it was a quill, the tip glistening with black ink that didn't drip no matter how long I stared. "I think you've got the wrong person," I said, though my feet stayed rooted to the ground. "I didn't order a map." The cartographer tilted his head, a faint smile curling at the edges of his thin lips. "Maps aren't ordered. They're earned." I wanted to leave. Every rational part of me screamed to turn around, walk away, and never look back. But the air around him seemed heavier, as if the world itself leaned in closer. And then he pointed to the chair in front of the desk, a simple wooden stool that hadn't been there a moment ago. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a request. Against my better judgment, I did. The moment I sat, the lantern's glow dimmed, and the forest around us seemed to vanish. It was just the desk, the cartographer, and an infinite stretch of darkness. The air smelled faintly of ink and something sharper like ozone. He picked up the quill, holding it delicately between his long fingers, and dipped it into the air above the parchment. There was no ink pot, just the quill hovering in the empty space, drawing a line of glistening black ink across the blank page. The line curved, twisted, and forked, forming what looked like roads or rivers. "This is your map," he said, his eyes never leaving the parchment. "Every path you've taken, every choice you've made." I leaned forward, my breath catching as I recognized some of the lines. There was the sharp bend that led to my grandmother's house when I was a child. The looping spiral of the hiking trail where I'd gotten lost for hours in high school. The jagged intersection where I'd missed a bus, only to run into the friend who'd changed my life. It was all there, every step of my life etched into ink. But then I noticed something strange. The map didn't stop at the edges of the page. The lines bled outward, disappearing into the desk, the air, the darkness itself. "What's out there?" I asked, pointing to where the ink dissolved into nothingness. "The paths you didn't take," he said simply. "Every road unwalked, every door unopened." I shivered. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you've reached a crossroads." He set the quill down and steepled his fingers, his glowing eyes boring into mine. "And crossroads demand a choice." I didn't understand, not at first. But then I looked back at the map and saw something new, a single line, faint and hesitant, branching off from the others. It stretched into the blank space at the bottom of the page, where no paths had gone before. "What happens if I take it?" I asked. "That depends," he said. "Not all paths lead forward. Some loop back, some unravel, and some," he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, "some lead to places that aren't meant to be found." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the faint new line. "Do I have to choose now?" The cartographer smiled again, a slow, unsettling expression. "The map is always watching," he said, "but the quill only moves when you do." I stood up, my chair scraping softly against the ground, or what I assumed was ground. The forest reappeared around us, the lantern's glow returning to its warm amber. The cartographer gathered his tools, rolling the map into a neat scroll and tucking it under one arm. "Wait," I said, panic rising in my chest. "What if I choose wrong?" His ember eyes flickered. "There is no wrong choice, only the road you take." And with that, he stepped into the shadows, his figure dissolving into the void, as if he'd never been there. The forest was silent again, the trail stretching out before me. I stood there for a long time, staring at the faint shimmer in the air where his desk had been. In my pocket, I felt the weight of something new. When I pulled it out, my fingers closed around a small brass compass, its needle spinning wildly. It still hasn't stopped. Let's start a new story. It happened on the subway, of all places. The same grimy train I took every day, packed with the same tired faces avoiding eye contact. I was in my usual spot, standing near the door because I couldn't snag a seat in time. The train jolted forward, and the lights flickered, as they always do. Nothing about the moment suggested anything extraordinary. But then the doors opened at a station that didn't exist. It wasn't on the map, not even close. The digital display overhead glitched out, flashing symbols I didn't recognize. The automated voice that normally announced the stops stayed silent. Instead of the expected platform, the doors revealed something impossible, a hallway. It wasn't like any subway station I'd ever seen. The tiles were glossy black, reflecting faint golden lights that seemed to float without source. The air smelled faintly of pine and something sweeter, like honey. And there was no one else, no passengers, no rushing crowds, no vending machines humming in the corner. I should have stayed on the train. I should have kept my head down, waited for the doors to close, and gone back to pretending that the world is predictable. But something about that hallway called to me. I stepped out. The doors hissed shut behind me, and the train rumbled away, leaving me alone in the stillness. The silence wasn't heavy or oppressive. It was curious, like the world was holding its breath to see what I would do next. There was no sign or direction, just the hallway stretching forward into the unknown. So I walked. The floor beneath my feet was warm, almost alive. The light swirled gently above me, casting shifting patterns that felt like they were telling a story, though I couldn't understand it. After what felt like hours, but might have been minutes, I reached a door. It wasn't a subway door or anything modern. It was carved from dark wood, with intricate designs of vines and stars. In the center was a small plaque that read, "The Room of Second Chances." I stared at the words for a long time, trying to piece together what they could mean. Finally, I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was impossibly vast, far larger than the hallway could have contained. It felt like stepping into a memory that wasn't mine. The walls were lined with shelves holding objects I couldn't immediately make sense of: an old teapot, a pair of ballet shoes, a cracked watch frozen at 11:11. Each item seemed to hum faintly, like they were alive in some quiet, secret way. At the center of the room was a table. On it sat a stack of envelopes, each sealed with red wax. A man stood behind the table, but he wasn't a man, not exactly. He was tall and thin, with skin the color of moonlight and eyes that glittered like they were made of shards of broken mirrors. His clothes were simple, but they shimmered faintly when he moved, like light was struggling to catch up with him. "You're late," he said, though there was no irritation in his voice. "Late for what?" I asked, my voice echoing too loudly in the stillness. "For your turn," he said, gesturing to the envelopes. "Pick one." I frowned. "What's in them?" "Second chances," he said, as if it were obvious. I didn't move. "At what?" He smiled, sharp and kind at the same time. "That depends on what you need." The room felt warmer now, the air thick with the scent of pine and honey. I stepped closer to the table, eyeing the envelopes. Each was identical, no markings or hints as to what they contained. "Do I have to choose?" I asked. "You already did," he said, his smile widening just slightly. I reached out, my fingers brushing the edge of one envelope. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than paper. I hesitated. "What happens if I open it?" His gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw something human in those mirror-bright eyes. "You get to change one thing, one moment, one choice, but only once. And if I don't, then you'll leave," he said simply. "And this place will forget you were ever here." I stared at the envelope in my hand, my chest tight with questions I couldn't untangle. What moment would I change? The time I didn't say goodbye? The time I let fear win? Or something smaller, something I couldn't see until I pulled the thread and felt the tapestry unravel? Finally, I asked, "What happens if I pick the wrong one?" He tilted his head, like the question amused him. "There are no wrong ones, only the ones you carry with you." The envelope in my hand pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. I pressed my thumb against the wax seal, and it melted away under my touch. Inside was a single card, blank except for 2 words written in elegant, looping script. "Turn back." I looked up at the man, confused. "What does this mean?" He stepped closer, his presence filling the room like the shifting of a tide. "It means the chance you need is not behind you. It's ahead. The door you must open hasn't arrived yet." The weight in my chest lightened just a little. I didn't know what I'd expected. Some grand undoing, some rewriting of the story I'd already lived. But his words made sense. In that way, dreams make sense right before you wake up. "What happens now?" I asked. He gestured to the door I'd come through, which had quietly opened again. The hallway stretched beyond it, the golden lights waiting to guide me back. "You go," he said, "and when the door finds you again, you'll know." I left the room without another word, the envelope still clutched in my hand. When I reached the hallway, it felt shorter this time. The hum of the subway returned, faint and familiar, and before I knew it, I was standing on a platform I recognized. The train pulled up, the doors opened, and I stepped inside. No one else on the train seemed to notice the envelope in my hand. When I looked down, it was empty now, the card gone. But the weight of it, the promise of it, remained. I don't know when I'll see the door again. Maybe tomorrow, maybe years from now. But when it comes, I'll be ready. Have you ever felt like you were given a glimpse of the map? Let's start a new story. The bus I boarded that morning wasn't mine. I was supposed to take the 42 into downtown, a mundane ride I'd done 100 times, earbuds in, and my mind miles away. But the 42 wasn't there when I arrived. Instead, a bus with no route number and no destination lit up on its sign pulled up to the curb. Its doors hissed open, and before I could second-guess myself, I climbed aboard. The driver, an older man with a face that looked like it had been carved from oak, didn't even glance at me as I swiped my card. "This isn't," I started, but the words caught in my throat. The way he held the wheel, hands as steady as granite, made me hesitate. Instead, I found a seat by the window, reasoning that I could hop off at the next stop and figure things out. The doors closed with a hiss, and the bus pulled away. That's when I noticed the silence. There was no engine noise, no murmur of other passengers. The bus was nearly full, but no one spoke. Everyone sat unnaturally still, staring straight ahead. The windows were fogged slightly, but as I wiped at mine, I realized it wasn't fog at all. It was frost forming delicate, intricate patterns that shifted and twisted as I watched. The street outside wasn't familiar anymore. The buildings I'd passed every morning were gone, replaced by towering, jagged shapes that glowed faintly. The sky was darker than it should have been for morning, streaked with bands of emerald green that looked too alive to be natural. I turned to the man sitting across from me, a wiry guy in a suit that looked a decade out of date. "Where's this bus going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned his head slowly, as if the movement took effort, and his eyes met mine. They weren't right. They shimmered faintly, reflecting the streaks of green in the sky outside. And when he smiled, it wasn't the kind of smile meant for comfort. "Forward," he said, his voice low and hollow. "Always forward." The bus lurched, and I gripped the armrest as it sped up, careening around corners that didn't seem to exist until we turned them. Outside, the landscape grew stranger. The buildings, if that's what they were, began to shift, their jagged edges melting into fluid shapes, then reforming into spires that seemed to scrape the sky. Trees with silver leaves loomed over the streets, their branches trailing wisps of light. I stood, gripping the back of the seat in front of me for balance. "I need to get off," I said, louder this time. The driver spoke for the first time. "There's only one stop," he said without turning around. His voice was deep and resonant, like the echo of a bell in a canyon. I looked around, hoping someone else would back me up, but the passengers remained silent, their gazes fixed forward. All except one. A girl a few rows ahead turned in her seat. Her face was pale, and her hair was a wild tangle of dark curls. But her eyes were sharp and clear, the only ones on the bus that didn't shimmer. She held my gaze for a moment, then stood and moved toward me. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered when she reached me, her voice urgent. "You got on by mistake." "I noticed," I said, glancing around. "What is this place? Where are we going?" She hesitated, glancing at the driver. "This bus doesn't go to places. It goes to moments. You still here." "What does that even mean?" She reached in her pocket and pulled out a small, folded card. It was yellowed with age and covered in tiny, cramped handwriting. She held it out to me. "Take it," she said. Before I could, the bus jerked again, harder this time, and I stumbled into her. She grabbed my arm, steadying me, but the card fluttered from her hand. I watched in horror as it landed on the floor and slid toward the back of the bus. Her face went pale. "No," she breathed, and before I could stop her, she darted after it, pushing past the silent passengers. The bus lurched again, and the lights overhead flickered. I grabbed the nearest pole for balance as the frost on the windows thickened, blocking out the strange world outside. "You shouldn't be standing," the driver said, his voice calm but firm. "It's not safe. Neither is this bus," I shouted. The girl had reached the back of the bus, and I saw her scoop up the card just as the lights flickered again, plunging us into momentary darkness. When they came back on, she was gone. The seat where she'd been sitting was empty, and no one seemed to notice. No one except me. I turned back to the driver, my heart pounding. "Stop the bus," I demanded. He glanced at me in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "We don't stop for mistakes," he said. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on me, and the frost on the windows began to glow faintly. Shapes moved within it, shadows that shifted and danced like they were trying to break through. The bus began to slow, and for a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to him. But when it stopped, the doors opened onto nothing. Not a street, not a building, not even the strange, glowing world I'd seen before. Just a vast, empty whiteness stretching in every direction. The driver turned to me. His eyes were no longer human. They burned with a cold, blue light. "This is your stop," he said. "I didn't choose this," I shouted. He tilted his head. "Didn't you?" The frost on the windows pulsed, and the shadows within it surged toward me. I stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The other passengers turned to watch, their shimmering eyes fixed on me as the bus began to dissolve, its edges blurring into the whiteness. And then, I woke up. I was sitting on a bench at the bus stop near my apartment, my groceries still in hand, the morning sun warm on my face. My heart was racing, and my palms were sweaty, but everything around me was normal. Familiar. Safe. Except for one thing. In my pocket, there was a card, yellowed with age, covered in tiny, cramped handwriting. And at the bottom, a single sentence. "The bus will come again." Let's start a new story. The first time I met Morgan, she was holding a dead pigeon. To be clear, she wasn't just holding it. She was cradling it in her hands like some tragic Shakespearean prop, staring down at it with a mixture of determination and sadness. I had just moved into my new apartment building, juggling a box of groceries while trying to find the right key, when I turned the corner and saw her crouched in the hallway. "Is this yours?" I asked stupidly, because what else do you say when someone is holding a pigeon corpse in the middle of your floor? Morgan looked up at me, her big round glasses slipping slightly down her nose, and said with a completely straight face, "It was alive when I found it." That should have been the moment I decided to never interact with her again. But instead, I was frozen there, caught between awkward politeness and morbid curiosity. She stood up, brushed off her jeans, and still holding the pigeon said, "I'm Morgan. I live 2 doors down from you. Don't worry, I'm not weird, I just couldn't leave it in the stairwell. Someone might have stepped on it." Then she walked past me and disappeared up the stairs. The whole thing was so surreal I had to convince myself it wasn't a hallucination. I spent the next week actively avoiding her, mostly because I didn't want to find out if she'd turned her apartment into a bird sanctuary or started performing pigeon autopsies in her kitchen. I figured she was just one of those quirky neighbors that you nod at in passing but never actually engage with. But Morgan had other plans. The next time I saw her, she was standing outside the building's front door, juggling 3 coffee cups and a bag of what looked like pastries. When she saw me, she lit up like we were old friends. "Hey, new neighbor," she said, as though the pigeon incident hadn't happened. "I bought too many croissants. Want one?" I hesitated. "Are they safe?" Her grin widened. "I swear they're not made of pigeon." Against my better judgment, I took one. It was warm and flaky, and probably the best croissant I'd ever had in my life. That should have been my first warning that Morgan had an uncanny ability to disarm people. From then on, she seemed to pop up everywhere. In the laundry room, helping someone untangle a hopeless knot of headphone wires. In the mailroom, handing out baked goods like it was Halloween. Once, I caught her leaving a bouquet of wildflowers on the doorstep of the grumpy old man who lived in 3B. She always had this strange energy about her, like she was both completely chaotic and entirely in control at the same time. It was exhausting just watching her, so I can't explain why I kept finding excuses to be around her. The real turning point came on a Saturday morning. I just poured myself a cup of coffee when I heard a frantic knock at my door. It was Morgan, wearing rain boots and a raincoat even though it was sunny outside. "I need a second pair of hands," she said, as if we discussed this beforehand. "For what?" I asked stupidly. "To rescue a turtle," she said. I should have said no. I had plans, boring ones, but plans nonetheless. Instead, I found myself trailing behind her to a nearby park where, sure enough, a small turtle was stuck in a drainage ditch. Morgan climbed in without hesitation, her boots sinking into the mud as she scooped up the turtle and handed it to me like it was a baby she was baptizing. "See," she said triumphantly. "Teamwork." It took another 20 minutes to rinse the mud off her boots, during which she casually asked, "What do you do for fun?" This isn't it," I said. She laughed, but she didn't let it drop. Over the next few weeks, Morgan had a way of pulling me into her world without me even realizing it. One day, it was helping her assemble a bookshelf that she'd insisted on rescuing from a curbside. Another day, it was following her to a farmer's market because, in her words, "These tomatoes will change your life." She seemed to collect people like others collect coins or stamps, but instead of locking them away, she shared them, introducing everyone in the building to one another in ways that felt both effortless and inevitable. One evening, I finally worked up the nerve to ask her about the pigeon. That first day we met, I began, trying not to sound accusatory. "What happened to it?" She didn't miss a beat. "Oh, I buried it in the garden out back. Gave it a nice spot under the cherry tree." "Why?" I asked. She shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do. Everything deserves a little dignity, don't you think? I didn't have an answer to that, but it stuck with me the way most things about Morgan did. One night, months later, we found ourselves sitting on the rooftop with a bottle of wine and a bag of stale cookies she'd deemed emergency snacks. The city hummed below us, all neon and noise, but up there it was quiet. She was telling me about the time she'd accidentally joined a protest in college because she thought it was a line for tacos, and I was laughing so hard I almost spilled my drink. At some point, the laughter faded, and there was just silence between us, comfortable, warm silence. She tilted her head back to look at the sky, her hair catching the light from the rooftop lanterns, and said, almost to herself, "It's funny, isn't it? How people get stuck thinking they have to be one thing or another. Like you have to be serious or silly, kind or tough. Why not both?" I didn't have an answer then, but I think I do now. Morgan wasn't just one thing. She was a mess of contradictions, gritty and graceful, chaotic and calm, fearless and fragile. She was the kind of person who'd cradle a dead pigeon one day and make you laugh until your ribs hurt the next. And somehow, in all her messy brilliance, she made me want to be a little better, a little braver, a little more alive. So, have you ever been completely wrong about someone at first? Let's start a new story. I noticed it one morning while sipping my coffee, staring blankly at the kitchen backsplash. There it was just above the countertop, a thin, jagged line cutting through the once pristine white tile. At first, I chalked it up to the usual wear and tear. Houses settle, walls shift, and life goes on. But over the next few days, the crack grew. By the end of the week, it had stretched halfway across the kitchen, splitting tiles like brittle candy. I ran my fingers over it, half expecting the wall to crumble under my touch. Instead, the surface felt wrong, warmer than it should have been, with a faint hum vibrating beneath my fingertips, like the heartbeat of something alive. That's when the dreams started. They weren't nightmares exactly, but they left me unsettled. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the images slipping away like water through cupped hands. There were flashes of dark corridors, walls that pulsed like lungs, and a deep, resonant voice whispering words I couldn't understand. The crack became an obsession. Every time I looked at it, I swore it had changed, new branches spidering out overnight, tiny chips of tile scattered like breadcrumbs. I called a contractor, hoping to make sense of it. When he arrived, he was all business, measuring and muttering about structural integrity. But the moment he touched the crack, he froze. "What the hell is that?" he murmured, pulling his hand back like he'd been burned. "What's what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he packed up his tools and left, muttering something about needing to consult an expert. He never came back. By the second week, the crack wasn't just in the wall anymore. It was in my mind. I started hearing things, soft whispers when I was alone in the house, faint scratching sounds that seemed to come from inside the walls. Once, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape slipping past the kitchen doorway. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I thought about leaving, packing a bag, and staying with a friend until I could figure out what was going on. But every time I tried, something held me back, a gnawing curiosity, a need to understand. Then, one night, I woke up to a noise that sent a chill down my spine. It was a low, guttural growl, vibrating through the house like an earthquake. I grabbed the nearest weapon I could find, a cast-iron skillet, and crept toward the kitchen. The crack was wider now, gaping like a wound. The hum I'd felt before had turned into a deep, rhythmic thrum, like the beat of a distant drum. As I stared, something moved inside the crack. A shadowy tendril snaked out, curling and uncurling like a living thing. I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. The tendril hesitated, as if sensing my fear, before retreating into the darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The wall didn't answer, but the whispers grew louder. That's when I saw it, a faint glow emanating from deep within the crack. It wasn't a natural light. It shimmered and pulsed, shifting through colors I couldn't name. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I leaned closer, trying to peer inside. The glow seemed to draw me in, pulling at the edges of my mind like an undertow. For a moment, I saw something, an endless void filled with writhing shapes, their forms too vast and strange to comprehend. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and I stumbled back, clutching my head. When I opened my eyes, the crack was gone. The wall was smooth, unblemished, as if nothing had ever been there. I thought I'd imagined it all, a fever dream brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But the next morning, I found a single tile on the kitchen floor, its surface scorched and cracked. And then there was the mark on my arm, a thin, jagged line etched into my skin, glowing faintly in the dark. Let's start a new story. When I opened my eyes this morning, it wasn't my alarm that woke me up. It was a slow, exasperated voice coming from my nightstand. "Oh, look who finally decided to rejoin the conscious world," it said, dripping with sarcasm. Meanwhile, I've been holding this glass of water all night. What am I? Your personal hydration assistant. I bolted upright, nearly knocking over said glass, which immediately shouted, "Hey, careful. I'm 90% full here. If I spill, we're all going to regret it." My first thought was that I must still be dreaming. My second thought was that I might need a therapist. The nightstand snorted. "You look confused. What's the matter? Never had a piece of furniture talk back before?" "No," I said out loud, my voice cracking. "No, I haven't." "Well," the nightstand replied, "get used to it. And maybe dust once in a while. I feel like I'm wearing a sweater made of neglect." I sat there, stunned, until my bed frame creaked underneath me and muttered, "Don't look at me for answers. I'm just here holding your lazy ass up every night. Speaking of which, you should really consider switching sleeping positions." You're murdering my left side. In a daze, I swung my feet to the floor. Big mistake. The rug, plush and seemingly harmless, screeched, "Whoa, shoes! You're about to step on me with shoes? Do I look like a doormat to you?" I froze mid-step. I'm sorry. The rug huffed indignantly. "You should be." Honestly, the disrespect. It muttered something about being the most unappreciated household item before falling silent. By the time I made it to the bathroom, I was starting to accept my new, bizarre reality. Or maybe I was just too tired to question it. The mirror greeted me with a bright, chipper tone that was somehow more unsettling than the nightstand's grumpiness. "Good morning." "Oh dear, that's quite a face you've got going on today. Did you sleep on a stack of bricks?" I frowned at my reflection. "Is it really that bad?" The mirror chuckled. "Let's just say it's not your best work. But hey, nothing a shower can't fix. Speaking of which, the shower head has been dying to complain about the water pressure. Brace yourself." Sure enough, as soon as I stepped into the shower head launched into a tirade. "Oh, fantastic. Here we go again. Let me guess. Hot water for 30 straight minutes while I do all the work? You ever stop to think about my needs?" "No. It's just spray until I'm clogged with soap scum." I reached for the shampoo bottle, hoping it would be less opinionated. It wasn't. "Oh, look," it said, its tone dripping with disdain. "Back for another glob of me, huh? Not like I have a limited lifespan or anything. No, use me up. It's not like conditioner ever pulls its weight." "Hey," the conditioner snapped from the corner. "I'm a closer, okay?" I smoothed things over. "You're just the appetizer." "I'm going insane," I whispered to myself. "Probably," the showerhead replied. "But who's keeping track?" By the time I got to the kitchen, I was bracing myself for another round of judgmental commentary. And boy, did the kitchen deliver. The toaster was waiting for me, its little lever bouncing like it had been rehearsing this moment all night. "Oh, here we go. Another day, another slice of bread. Do you even taste what I make for you? Or do you just cram it in your mouth like a barbarian?" The bread loaf, sitting innocently on the counter, added, "Don't blame me if the toast comes out dry. You left me open last night, and now I'm basically stale. Amateur move." The fridge was next, its voice deep and gruff, like an overworked bouncer. "Before you go rooting around in here, let me just say, that milk's on its last legs, the cheese is plotting an escape, and the broccoli? Yeah, it's not even broccoli anymore. It's just sadness. I didn't even make coffee. I couldn't face whatever the coffee maker had to say about my caffeine dependency. Instead, I decided to step outside and get some fresh air. The moment I opened the door, the wind swirled around me, whispering, out of the cave at last. Don't worry, we'll blow some life into you." "Thanks," I said, unsure how to respond to sentient weather. Down the street, a group of pigeons was having a heated debate on a power line. "I'm telling you, the breadcrumbs by the fountain are the best in town," one said, flapping its wings for emphasis. "You're an idiot," another replied. "The sandwich shop dumpster is where it's at. Gourmet scraps, no competition." A squirrel scurried across my path, pausing to give me an unimpressed once-over. "No nuts?" it asked. Typical human, always taking, never giving. I wandered aimlessly for a while, tuning into the hum of the world around me. Cars grumbled about potholes, trees groaned about woodpeckers, and even the sidewalk whispered complaints about gum and graffiti. It was overwhelming but oddly fascinating, like peeling back a layer of reality I didn't know existed. By the time I made it back home, I was exhausted. I flopped onto the couch, which immediately grunted, "Wow, right on the springs. You really know how to hurt a guy, don't you?" I groaned. "Can I just have 5 minutes of silence?" The TV turned on by itself, the screen flickering to life. "Sure, if you don't mind staring at a blank wall. But hey, I've got new episodes of that guilty pleasure show you love." Just saying. I laughed despite myself. It was ridiculous. All of it. But somehow, it wasn't terrible. The world felt alive in a way I'd never noticed before. And even though everything had a complaint or a snarky remark, it also had personality. Charm, even. It was like living in a sitcom where the cast was my entire environment. So now I have to ask, if your world came to life like mine, if everything you touched had something to say, would you embrace the chaos? Or would you go absolutely insane trying to find an off switch? Let's start a new story. I never thought a game of Scrabble could change my life. It started as a normal Thursday, one of those days that fade into the blur of routine. My best friend, Danny, had invited me over for our weekly antisocial club night, a tradition born out of mutual disdain for people who didn't understand the beauty of staying in. The plan was simple: pizza, beer, and a board game. The usual. But this time, something was different. The air between us felt charged, like the quiet before a storm. I didn't think much of it until we were halfway through our game, the board littered with words like vortex and serendipity. Danny had always been annoyingly good at Scrabble, turning even the simplest letters into points I couldn't catch up to. He was sitting across from me, his face lit by the dim glow of a desk lamp, his dark curls a mess from the way he kept running his hands through them. It was my turn, but I wasn't paying attention. Instead, I was staring at his lips, the way they curled when he smiled after playing another 7-letter word. I'd known Danny for 12 years, but tonight, for some inexplicable reason, I was noticing things about him I'd never let myself notice before. "Your turn," he said, his voice pulling me back to reality. I blinked, my cheeks flushing. "Right? Sorry." He smirked. Daydreaming again? Just strategizing. I lied, grabbing tiles and trying to focus. That's when I saw it. His last play, spelled out on the board like a message I wasn't sure I was supposed to read. Feelings. I froze. It wasn't the word itself. It was the way he looked at me after playing it. Like he was waiting for something. My mind raced. Was this some kind of joke? A coincidence? Or was he trying to tell me something without actually saying it? "Danny," I said, trying to sound casual. "You okay?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Yeah, why wouldn't I be? I don't know. Just you're acting weird." He shrugged, but his expression betrayed him. He wasn't just playing Scrabble anymore. He was playing a game I didn't know the rules to, and I didn't like not knowing. We continued the game, but the tension between us grew with every move. When it was his turn again, he placed another word, this one nestled neatly against feelings. Hidden. I stared at the board, my heart pounding. My mouth opened, but no words came out. This wasn't just Scrabble. This was a confession, one tile at a time. "Are we still playing?" Danny asked, his voice softer now. I looked up at him, searching his face for answers. "What are you doing?" He hesitated, his fingers drumming against the edge of the table. "Just trying something new." By spelling cryptic messages during Scrabble? He laughed, but it was nervous, shaky. "You always said you liked puzzles." My chest tightened, a mix of fear and something I couldn't name. This was Danny, my anchor, my constant. The person who knew every embarrassing secret, every bad decision. If this was real, if he was really trying to say what I thought he was, everything could change. But then, something inside me shifted. I realized I didn't want to keep playing it safe. Not with him. So I reached for my tiles, my hands trembling, and played a word of my own. "Why?" He looked at the board, then at me. For a moment, I thought he might backtrack, laugh it off as a joke. But instead, he leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm tired of pretending." The world seemed to tilt. "Pretending what?" "That I don't." He trailed off, rubbing the back of his neck. "That I don't feel something for you. Something more than just friends." The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile. My mind flashed back to years of late-night talks, road trips, inside jokes. The way he always seemed to know exactly what I needed, even when I didn't know myself. And suddenly it all made sense. I played another word, same. Danny's eyes widened, his expression a mix of disbelief and relief. "Really? Really?" I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He laughed, a genuine, joyful sound that made my chest ache in the best way. "You could have just said something, you know." "Yeah, well," I said, smiling. "I thought we were sticking to the game." The rest of the night was a blur. We didn't finish the Scrabble game, too caught up in the thrill of finally acknowledging what had been there all along. Danny kissed me in the kitchen, his hands cupping my face like he was afraid I might disappear. It wasn't perfect, his nose bumped mine, and we both laughed mid-kiss. But it was real, and that was all that mattered. Months later, we still laugh about the Scrabble confession. The board is framed now, a reminder of the night everything changed. It's not just a game anymore. It's the start of a story, one we're still writing, one word at a time. Let's start a new story. This morning, I woke up to find my entire apartment had turned upside down. Not metaphorically, like the floor was now the ceiling, the furniture was dangling precariously above me, and my bed was somehow stuck to what used to be the ceiling fan. Gravity was confused, and so was I. It took a minute for me to process what was happening, mostly because my coffee maker was dangling directly above my head. And if there's one thing you don't want raining down on you at 7 a.m., it's hot coffee and glass shards. As I slid out of bed, or up out of bed, onto what used to be the ceiling, I heard a faint buzzing noise. I turned around and saw something I definitely wasn't prepared for. A small, neon blue raccoon sitting in midair, legs crossed, tail swishing like it had all the time in the world. Finally awake, the raccoon said, voice a little too casual for someone who just turned my apartment into an M.C. Escher painting. We gotta talk. About what? I managed, because what else do you say to a glowing raccoon defying gravity in your living room? The raccoon held up what looked like a clipboard, though it was made of some kind of shifting, iridescent material that hurt my eyes if I stared at it too long. So here's the deal. You've been chosen. Chosen for what? My voice cracked slightly. To fix this, the raccoon replied, gesturing with one paw at the surreal mess around us. Obviously, I don't even know what this is. The raccoon sighed, like it had been through this conversation 100 times. All right, quick crash course. You're in a pocket of the Imaginarium. Basically, the universe's attic where all the half-finished ideas and abandoned concepts go. It's a little chaotic because, it trailed off scratching behind one glowing ear. Management's been on vacation for a few centuries. So, why me? Good question, the raccoon said brightly, before flipping through its clipboard. Let's see. Here we go. Chosen because their imagination is vast, but wildly underutilized. Ouch. That's a bit harsh, huh? Excuse me? Don't take it personally. Look, you're creative, but you haven't done anything with it in a while. Now's your chance to shine. Or fail spectacularly. Either way, it'll be entertaining for me. Before I could argue, the raccoon snapped its fingers, or whatever the raccoon equivalent of snapping is, and the room shifted again. My apartment dissolved into a sprawling, impossible landscape. The sky was a gradient of colors that kept shifting. The ground was a patchwork of different terrains, grass, sand, cobblestones, and what looked suspiciously like frosting. And creatures wandered about. Giant turtles wearing top hats, floating jellyfish made of light, and one very large snail that seemed to be delivering mail. What am I supposed to do? I asked, trying to keep my breakfast down as the ground beneath me undulated like waves. You're going to rebuild this place, the raccoon said, now lounging in a hammock strung between two palm trees that hadn't been there 5 seconds ago. See that over there? It pointed to a massive, cracked tower in the distance, pieces of it floating in the air like a jigsaw puzzle mid-assembly. That's the core of the Imaginarium. It's broken. You fix it, everything goes back to normal. You don't, and it made a vague explosion gesture with its paws. Why can't you fix it? The raccoon snorted. Do I look like someone who fixes things? I'm middle management. I delegate. I sighed, already regretting every decision that had led me to this moment. Fine, how do I fix it? Easy, the raccoon said, tossing me a tiny glowing orb. You use your imagination. The orb was warm in my hand, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. Before I could ask for more details, the raccoon vanished, leaving me alone in this bizarre, kaleidoscopic world. Great, I muttered. Use my imagination. Real specific. I started walking toward the broken tower, dodging what I could only describe as rogue ideas, flying books with teeth, a sentient cloud that kept trying to braid my hair, and a field of giant daisies that shouted compliments at me. Nice socks. You're doing great. As I got closer to the tower, I realized the ground wasn't random. It was reacting to me. Where I stepped, the terrain changed to things I loved. a carpet of stars, an ice rink that didn't feel cold, and even a path lined with streetlights that flickered on as I passed. When I finally reached the base of the tower, the orb in my hand glowed brighter, and the pieces of the tower began to tremble. "Okay," I said to no one in particular. "Igasi Imichi?" I closed my eyes and focused. I pictured the tower whole again, imagined its pieces clicking back into place like magnets. The orb grew hot in my hand, and when I opened my eyes, the tower was still broken. Except now it was also covered in polka dots. "Well, that's not helpful." "Not bad for a first try," a familiar voice said. I turned to see the raccoon lounging on a cloud. "You gotta put more of yourself into it. You're just guessing. What do you want it to look like?" I frowned, thinking, what did I want? The Imaginarium wasn't just broken. It was disjointed, full of unfinished thoughts and half-baked ideas. I wanted it to be whole, unified, a place where everything fit, even the weird stuff. I held the orb again and focused, this time pouring my own memories into it. I thought of the forts I used to build as a kid, the way I'd always try to make them cozy and safe. I thought of starry skies and hidden corners, of places that felt like secrets waiting to be discovered. I thought of laughter and wonder, of stories that made the world feel bigger. The orb pulsed, and this time, the tower responded. The pieces began to move, snapping together with a sound like chimes. When it was done, the tower wasn't just fixed. It was alive. Its walls shimmered with color. Its windows glowed warmly, and vines sprouted along its edges, blooming with flowers that hummed softly. The whole Imaginarium seemed to sigh in relief, the chaotic landscape around me settling into something harmonious. "Well, I'll be," the raccoon said, hopping down from its cloud. "You actually did it." The orb disappeared, and the raccoon handed me a slip of paper. "Your exit pass. Unless you want to stay?" I looked around at the now stable Imaginarium, a world brimming with endless possibilities. "What happens if I stay?" "You become a keeper," the raccoon said. "It's a big job, lots of responsibility, and you'd have to deal with me." "Tempting," I said with a grin, pocketing the pass. "But I think I'll pass this time." The raccoon winked. "Fair enough, but don't lose that imagination of yours. You'll need it back in the real world." I stepped through the glowing door that appeared and found myself back in my apartment. The furniture was right side up again, the coffee maker was intact, and everything seemed normal, except for a glowing, polka-dotted flower blooming on my windowsill. So now I have to ask, if you were pulled into a world where imagination was the only thing keeping it together, what would you build? And would you stay to see it through? Let's start a new story. It wasn't a place, exactly, but a moment. A feeling suspended in amber that I can revisit whenever the world feels too sharp around the edges. It's the kind of memory you don't realize is stitching itself into your soul until years later, when it comes rushing back like the first warm wind of spring. It starts with an afternoon, heavy and golden, in the backyard of the house where I grew up. The fence was lopsided, patched with bits of scrap wood my dad hammered in whenever the wind knocked a piece loose. The grass was wild, mostly weeds, dotted with dandelions, and those little white flowers my mom always said weren't really flowers at all. To me, they were a garden. There was this tree, an old birch that leaned slightly to one side, like it was trying to whisper a secret to the house. Its bark peeled off in papery curls, and I'd collect the pieces, pretending they were ancient scrolls from some forgotten kingdom. My brother and I used to climb that tree, not to go anywhere, but just to sit in the crook of its branches and look out at the world from a few feet higher. When you're a kid, even a little height feels like flying. That particular day, I just learned how to whistle. Not well, just this thin, shaky tune that wavered like a baby bird finding its wings. But I was proud of it. I sat cross-legged on the grass, trying to mimic the sound of a morning dove I'd heard earlier. It felt like a conversation, one the bird probably didn't even know we were having. My brother was sprawled on his back nearby, chewing a blade of grass and squinting at the clouds. He had this theory that clouds were alive, just slower than us. "They don't talk like we do," he said, gesturing to the sky. "But they're always moving, always watching. At the time, I believed him. I wanted to. It made the world seem so much bigger, like it had secrets we'd never fully unravel. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed, and the faint sound of a radio drifted through the open window of the kitchen. My mom was inside, baking something. I don't remember what, but I remember the smell, warm and sugary, curling through the screen door. She had this way of humming when she worked, little snippets of songs she'd never finish. It's funny how much comfort you can find in something so small. Later, when the sun started to dip, my dad came outside carrying the sprinkler. It was one of those old metal ones, the kind that spun in slow, lazy arcs, throwing droplets into the air like tiny fireworks. He set it up in the middle of the yard and called out, "Who's brave enough to run through?" That was the kind of challenge you couldn't ignore. We ran, of course, barefoot, laughing, the cold spray shocking against our skin every time we passed through. The grass turned slick, and we kept slipping, tumbling into each other in a tangle of arms and legs and giggles. The kind of laughter that's wild and uncontrollable, the kind that fills your lungs so completely it feels like flying all over again. The sun dipped lower, turning the droplets into tiny rainbows, and for a moment, the whole world shimmered. Afterward, we collapsed onto the porch, still damp, the wood warm under our legs from the day's heat. My mom brought out popsicles, red for me, orange for my brother, and we sat there, sticky and content, watching the first fireflies blink to life in the dusk. I remember thinking they looked like stars that had come down to visit us, just for the night. Years later, I tried to describe this memory to someone, but I couldn't quite get it right. How do you explain the way the air felt? The weightlessness of being young and untethered, where time didn't stretch forward endlessly, but existed only in that exact moment. How do you capture the way the light shifted, the sound of the sprinkler hissing, the rhythm of bare feet on wet grass? I still think about that day sometimes. Not often, but enough. When the world feels heavy, or when I'm standing outside in the evening and catch the scent of something faintly sweet on the breeze. I'll close my eyes and go back, just for a second, to that golden afternoon where the clouds were alive and the trees whispered, and the air was full of laughter and sunlight. Do you ever have memories like that? Ones you don't even mean to keep, but they stay with you anyway, tucked into the quiet corners of your mind? Tell me about them. I want to know what your sunlight feels like. Let's start a new story. It was supposed to be a quick stop, gas up, grab snacks, and keep heading west. But the second I stepped into the gas station, I knew something was off. For one, it was too clean. The floors gleamed like someone had just waxed them, and the shelves were perfectly organized, as if the chips and candy bars had been placed there by an art director. The air smelled faintly of lavender, not stale coffee and grease. And behind the counter, the cashier, a man with silver hair slicked back like an old Hollywood star, was smiling in a way that felt both welcoming and unsettling. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate, like he was savoring the word. "What brings you to our little corner of the world?" I hesitated, just passing through. "Isn't everyone?" he replied, his smile widening. There was no one else in the store, and the lights above didn't hum the way fluorescent lights usually do. Everything was too quiet, like the building had been soundproof from the rest of the world. I grabbed a bottle of water and a bag of pretzels, hoping to make the interaction as quick as possible. But as I approached the counter, the man tilted his head slightly, studying me. "You have time," he said. It wasn't a question. "Excuse me?" I asked, feeling the hairs on my arms rise. He gestured toward the back of the store, where a small, handwritten sign hung above a door. "Back room. Curiosities and rarities." "Take a look," he said, his smile never wavering. "It's not every day you find a place like this." I wanted to say no, to pay for my things and leave, but something about his tone, or maybe just the strangeness of the place, made me pause. Against my better judgment, I walked to the door and pushed it open. The back room was nothing like the front. It was dimly lit with shelves and tables cluttered with objects that seemed impossible to categorize. Jars of swirling, metallic liquid. Books bound in materials I couldn't identify. An old rotary phone with no cord, its dial softly glowing. A clock on the wall ticked backward, and a birdcage in the corner held what looked like a single floating feather, suspended in midair. Find anything interesting? The cashier's voice was suddenly behind me, though I hadn't heard him follow. What is this place? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped past me and picked up a small wooden box from one of the tables. It was plain, unmarked, and unremarkable. But when he opened it, I felt a rush of cold air, and for a brief moment, I saw something that wasn't there, a memory of myself as a child, running through a field I couldn't quite place, laughing at something I couldn't remember. This, he said, closing the box with a soft click, is yours. I shook my head. I don't understand. Few do at first, he said, placing the box into my hands. Think of this place as a crossroads. People come here when they need something, even if they don't know what it is. And you, my friend, need this. The box was warm now, as if it had been sitting in sunlight. My first instinct was to give it back, to walk away, but my fingers tightened around it instead. How much is it? I asked, because that seemed like the logical thing to say. The cashier chuckled. The price isn't mine to set. You'll know when it's time. What does that mean? I asked, but he was already walking away, back through the door to the front of the store. I followed him, clutching the box, but when I stepped back into the brightly lit gas station, the man was gone. The counter was empty, the register silent. I turned in a slow circle, my pulse racing, and realized I couldn't hear any cars outside. No wind, no sounds at all. I left the money for the water and pretzels on the counter, more out of habit than anything, and stepped outside, back into a world that somehow felt sharper, more vivid. The sky seemed bigger, the air heavier with the scent of rain on the horizon. The drive that followed was surreal. I kept glancing at the box on the passenger seat, half expecting it to vanish or change shape. I thought about opening it again, but the memory of that fleeting vision, the field, the laughter, felt too fragile to disturb. Hours later, I reached the next town and pulled into a motel. The clerk at the front desk handed me a key with a bored expression, and I settled into a room that smelled faintly of mildew. It was only then, in the quiet solitude of a cheap motel room, that I dared to open the box again. This time, the rush of cold air was stronger and the vision sharper, a moment I hadn't thought about in years. I was sitting at a kitchen table, a plate of cookies in front of me, while my grandmother told me a story. Her voice was soft, soothing, and I could smell the cinnamon in the cookies as clearly as if I were there. She was telling me about the importance of never losing sight of what matters most. I couldn't remember the exact words, only the feeling, comfort, safety, love. The vision faded, leaving me staring at the empty box. My chest felt tight, but not in a bad way. It was as if something I hadn't realized was missing had been returned to me. I don't know how long I sat there, holding the box, but when I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of more moments like that, small, forgotten pieces of my life that had been buried under years of routine and noise. When I woke up, I felt lighter, like a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying had been lifted. The box sat on the nightstand, looking completely ordinary, but I knew it wasn't. I still don't know what that gas station was, or who the cashier really was. But every once in a while, when I feel lost or disconnected, I open the box, and it gives me something I didn't even know I needed. Have you ever stumbled across something, or someone, that felt like it was waiting for you all along? Let's start a new story. The morning started with a fish. Not the graceful leap of a fish breaking the surface of a lake, but the slap of a slimy trout against the side of a building. I was walking to work, headphones in, coffee in hand, lost in some melancholic indie song, when the fish hit the brick wall next to me with a wet thwack. I froze. Turning toward the impact, I spotted it on the sidewalk, a trout, freshly dead and glistening under the early sunlight. Before I could process why a fish was airborne on a city street, I heard laughter from above. Leaning out of a second-story window was a woman holding what looked like a fishing rod, her bright orange hair haloed by the morning light. She grinned down at me like a child caught red-handed, but proud of their mischief. "Sorry about that," she called. "Did you just throw a fish at me?" I asked, more bewildered than angry. "Not at you," she replied, pointing toward the fish like that cleared everything up. It got away from me. I looked up at her, then at the trout, then back at her. "You're fishing from a window?" Obviously, she said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Against my better judgment, I asked, "Why?" She smirked. "Why not? I should have kept walking, left her and her ridiculous trout behind. Instead, I said, 'You missed the river by about a mile.'" She laughed, loud and unrestrained, then disappeared from the window. A second later, the building's door swung open, and there she was barefoot, holding the fishing rod in one hand and a string of tangled line in the other. "Want a coffee?" she asked, as though inviting someone inside after a trout-throwing incident was perfectly ordinary. I had every reason to say no. I was late, my coffee was lukewarm, and this woman was clearly some kind of chaos incarnate. But instead, I heard myself say, "Sure." Her apartment was small and cluttered, the kind of place that looked like it had been curated by a raccoon with a flair for the dramatic. Plants dangled precariously from every ledge, books were stacked in haphazard towers, and an old record player hummed quietly in the corner, spinning some jazzy tune I didn't recognize. She gestured for me to sit on the couch, a threadbare thing covered in mismatched cushions, and handed me a mug with a cartoon crab on it. "So," I said, watching as she tossed the fishing rod onto a pile of what looked like costume jewelry. "Are you always this unconventional, or is today special?" She grinned, flopping into an armchair. "Life's too short to be boring," she said, as though this were some ancient wisdom. I learned her name was Quinn. She worked as a freelance illustrator and had a penchant for collecting things other people threw away. The fishing rod, she explained, had been salvaged from a dumpster. The trout, she admitted, had been purchased from the market that morning on a whim. "I thought it would be funny," she said, stirring her coffee with a spoon shaped like a flamingo. "And was it? Depends. Did it ruin your morning or improve it?" I considered this. Objectively, it should have been a disaster. A fish to the face was hardly anyone's idea of a good time. But there was something disarming about her unabashed absurdity, her willingness to treat life like an elaborate inside joke. "Still deciding," I said, earning another laugh. We ended up talking for hours, the kind of rambling conversation that twists and turns like a river, covering everything from favorite sandwiches to childhood fears. She told me about the time she tried to make her own fireworks and almost burned down a shed. I told her about my failed attempt to foster a dog, which ended with my mom adopting it instead. At some point, the coffee ran out, and Quinn suggested we go get ice cream instead. The ice cream shop was a hole-in-the-wall place with a sign so faded you could barely read it. Quinn ordered 2 scoops of something neon green, while I stuck with vanilla, prompting her to call me tragically predictable. We sat on a park bench, watching pigeons fight over a half-eaten pretzel, and she asked, "What's the weirdest thing you've ever done?" I thought about it for a moment, then admitted I wasn't sure. My life felt embarrassingly normal compared to hers. "Well," she said, licking her ice cream thoughtfully, "I guess you'll just have to fix that." By the time the sun began to set, I realized I'd forgotten about work entirely. Quinn walked me back to my apartment, and as we stood awkwardly outside my door, I found myself wishing the day didn't have to end. "You know," she said, tucking a strand of orange hair behind her ear, "I still have the rest of that fish. Want to see what else we can do with it?" It was the most ridiculous offer I'd ever received. Naturally, I said yes. That's how it began. An ordinary morning disrupted by a flying trout and a woman who lived like the universe was her playground. Quinn became a part of my life in the same way storms roll in, sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. We didn't end up doing anything particularly useful with the trout, but I kept the memory of that first day, and every time I see a fishing rod or a fish market, I can't help but grin. Sometimes life throws a trout at you. If you're lucky, you'll catch it. If you're luckier, you'll catch Quinn. Let's start a new story. They weren't even my socks. They were my neighbor's, a pair of white, slightly dingy ankle socks, lying limp in the middle of the sidewalk like 2 disgraced marshmallows. I noticed them on my morning walk, the kind of walk you take because you're trying to convince yourself you're a person who takes walks. Normally, I would have stepped over them without a second thought, but for some reason that day, I stopped. There was something tragic about those socks. They looked so out of place, sprawled there on the concrete, separated from whatever life they used to belong to. Socks aren't supposed to be lone rangers. Their pairs, partners, allies in the battle against blisters. Yet here they were, abandoned and forlorn. I crouched down to look at them more closely, as if they might whisper their story to me. One of them had a faint, grass-colored smear on the heel, like it had seen better days in the yard. The other had a loose thread spiraling out from the cuff. What had happened? A l'autre basket mi-shop? A rogue gust of wind? A tiny domestic tragedy involving a backyard clothesline? And then the thought hit me like an awkward but earnest lightning bolt. I should do something about these socks. For the record, I'm not usually the kind of person who feels called to action by street litter. But something about the socks, maybe the way they looked so defeated, like they'd been discarded by the universe itself, stirred something in me. I reached down and picked them up, holding them gingerly between two fingers like they might bite. They were softer than I expected. A little damp, but not gross damp. Just rain damp. I had no plan, no logical reason for what I was doing, but I started carrying them with me. I figured I'd toss them in the nearest trash can, but the longer I held them, the more that felt wrong. These weren't just trash. They were survivors. And somehow, they were now my responsibility. By the time I got back to my apartment, I decided to wash them. I filled the sink with hot, soapy water and let the socks soak while I ate breakfast. I even gave them a little scrub with the dish sponge, the non-scrubby side. What kind of monster do you think I am? Afterward, I wrung them out, hung them on the shower rod to dry, and forgot about them. Until the next morning, when I went to take a shower, there they were, hanging like little ghosts in the steam. Clean, renewed, ready for something. But what? They weren't mine. I didn't know who they belonged to. I couldn't just keep them. What would I even do with a pair of socks that didn't fit? So I did what any reasonable person would do. I wrote a note. It was a weird note. Found your socks on the sidewalk. They looked sad, so I washed them. Now they're happy. If they're yours, you can find them hanging on the bulletin board in the lobby. I pinned the socks to the note with a clothespin and left them dangling on the board for all to see. Honestly, I expected nothing. Socks don't usually inspire much follow-up. But then 2 days later, I saw it. A second note, written in a rushed scrawl and pinned where the socks had been. Thank you. Didn't think anyone would care about a stupid pair of socks. Needed that. I stared at the note for a long time. Hey, who was A? What had they been going through that made my small act of sock rescue matter to them? I'll probably never know. And honestly, I don't need to, because something shifted for me after that. It wasn't about the socks. It was about the quiet little reminder that even the smallest, dumbest gestures can ripple out in ways you'll never see. Now, whenever I walk by the spot where I found them, I smile. I think about how a pair of stray socks somehow became a bridge between two strangers, a tiny, unexpected thread of connection in a world that often feels too big and too lonely. So I have to ask, what's the smallest thing you've done or someone's done for you that ended up mattering more than it should have? I hope it didn't involve damp socks, but hey, I'm open to surprises. Let's start a new story. There's something about parking garages that feels inherently dramatic. The echoes, the shadows, the way your footsteps sound like someone else is following you. It's like the universe designed them for awkward encounters or crime dramas. My particular parking garage moment, however, had nothing to do with crime and everything to do with a chicken. Yes, a literal chicken. It happened last winter after an excruciatingly long day at work. The kind of day where your brain feels like it's been used as a stress ball. All I wanted was to get to my car, drive home, and melt into my couch. The garage was mostly empty, just a few scattered cars and that industrial hum of fluorescent lights. I pressed the unlock button on my key fob and heard the reassuring chirp of my car somewhere in the distance. Then I heard something else, a clucking noise. I froze. There it was again, louder this time. Cluck, 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 like a bad cartoon sound effect. I glanced around, half expecting to see a prankster with a chicken-themed ringtone, but no. Emerging from behind a pillar, strutting with the kind of confidence I could only dream of, was an actual chicken. A hen, to be precise. She was magnificent, feathers a little ruffled, but mostly a sleek, tawny brown. She looked at me with the sharp, calculating eyes of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, which was more than I could say for myself. "Hey there," I said, because apparently I talk to chickens now. She clucked again, which I interpreted as, "What's it to you?" I glanced around, hoping anyone else would appear and validate that this wasn't just a stress-induced hallucination. The garage stayed empty. The chicken, however, seemed very real, and she had zero interest in explaining why she was wandering a multi-level parking structure in the dead of winter. "Are you lost?" I asked, taking a cautious step forward. She tilted her head, as if pondering the question, then flapped her wings and sprinted toward a car. Not my car, some other poor soul's dented sedan. She scurried under it and disappeared. At this point, I had two choices. I could leave and pretend this never happened, or I could get down on my hands and knees in a freezing parking garage to investigate the whereabouts of a road chicken. Naturally, I chose option 2. I crouched next to the car and peered underneath. Sure enough, there she was, perched on top of the back axle like she was hiding from the poultry mafia. "All right," I muttered. "Let's get you out of there." What followed was a deeply uncoordinated dance of me, trying to coax her out without spooking her. I tried clucking back at her. Terrible idea. I tried using my granola bar as bait. Chickens apparently don't like oats and raisins. I even tried singing, because why not? None of it worked. She just sat there, blinking at me like I was the biggest idiot she'd ever seen. And she was probably right. Just when I was about to give up, a voice behind me said, "Need a hand?" I jumped, smacking my head on the car's bumper. When I turned around, a guy about my age was standing there, holding a gym bag and looking deeply amused. "You all right?" he asked, biting back a grin. "Yeah," I said, rubbing my head. "There's, a chicken under this car." He didn't laugh or ask if I was joking. Instead, he set his bag down and crouched next to me. "Let me guess. She's not coming out?" I shook my head. "No, she's made it her new home." He nodded, as if rogue parking garage chickens were just another Tuesday for him. "All right, you block that side. I'll see if I can grab her." And just like that, we were a team. I positioned myself at one end of the car while he wriggled halfway underneath, muttering things like, "It's okay, girl, we're not going to hurt you," in the soothing tones of a chicken whisperer. It took a few tries, but eventually, he emerged triumphant, holding the hen gently but firmly. "She's a beauty," he said, standing up and cradling her like she was the star of a petting zoo. "Yeah," I said, still in shock. "But what do we do with her?" He thought for a moment, then said, "My sister has a small farm. She can take her." "You're just ready to adopt a random parking garage chicken?" He grinned. "You don't leave a lady like this behind." We ended up walking to his car together. The chicken nestled in his arms like this was the most natural thing in the world. On the way, we started talking about the absurdity of the situation, about how he'd ended up at the gym because his heater broke, about how I'd spent my day arguing with a malfunctioning copier. By the time we reached his car, I realized I was actually having fun. Over a chicken. He opened the back door, placed the hen in a cardboard box lined with a towel, and turned to me. "Thanks for the assist." "No problem," I said, suddenly wishing I didn't have to leave. "She's in good hands." He smiled. "Maybe I'll give you an update. On her new life." I laughed. "Sure, I'd like that." And that's how I ended up giving my number to a guy I met while rescuing a parking garage chicken. He texted me the next day to let me know she was settling in nicely on the farm and had already claimed a perch in the coop. We've been texting ever since, mostly about the chicken at first, but eventually about everything else too. Sometimes, life hands you a ridiculous scenario you never could have scripted. And if you're lucky, that ridiculous scenario comes with a surprise friendship, or maybe something more. So, what about you? Have you ever had one of those absurd moments that ended up changing your day or your life in a way you didn't expect? I'd love to hear it. Maybe the universe loves a good laugh, after all. Let's start a new story. Not new ones. Old, battered sneakers I'd shoved into the back of my closet years ago. Too sentimental to throw away, but too tattered to wear. That Saturday morning, as I was half-heartedly sorting through my things, I found them buried under a tangle of forgotten scarves and mismatched socks. The laces were frayed, the soles worn smooth, but something about them tugged at me. I laced them up and decided to take a walk. No destination in mind, just the vague notion of getting out of the apartment before the day dissolved into another scroll through endless social media feeds. The city was alive in that chaotic, pre-summer way. Sunbathers sprawling in the parks, food vendors hawking their wares, the air buzzing with heat and impatience. The sneakers felt strange at first, as if they were remembering my feet, and then something else. I don't know how to describe it, but the more I walked, the more I felt like the shoes were guiding me, like they knew where I needed to go. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but I swear I wasn't choosing my direction. I was being pulled gently but insistently. The route grew unfamiliar quickly. I turned down streets I'd never noticed before, past ivy-covered buildings and empty lots overrun with wildflowers. It wasn't long before I found myself standing in front of an archway made of rusted iron, its gate propped open just enough to invite curiosity. Beyond it was a path winding through a grove of ancient trees. The air was cooler here, heavier, carrying the faint scent of moss and rain. A sign hung from the gate, its letters faded, but still legible. No maps needed. That should have been my cue to turn around, but instead, I stepped through. The path twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. One moment, I was walking through a tunnel of flowering vines, their blossoms glowing softly, as if lit from within. And the next, I was on a rocky trail that overlooked a sea of golden grass. There was no horizon, just an endless stretch of shimmering air. It wasn't like any place I'd seen before, or any place I thought could exist. And yet, I wasn't afraid. If anything, I felt lighter, as though the very act of being there had peeled away layers of stress and doubt I didn't know I was carrying. I don't know how long I walked before I heard it, a faint melody drifting through the trees. It was haunting and beautiful, a song without words that seemed to speak directly to some hidden part of me. The sneakers urged me forward, faster now, until I emerged into a clearing. There was a man sitting on a weathered bench at the center of the clearing, playing a strange-looking instrument that glimmered like it was carved from moonlight. He was old, ancient even, but his eyes sparkled with a youthful mischief. Around him, the clearing was dotted with objects: a broken clock, a shattered mirror, a wilted flower in a cracked vase. He stopped playing when he saw me and smiled, his teeth bright against his weathered skin. "Took you long enough," he said, as though we'd known each other forever. Sorry," I stammered, caught completely off guard. He chuckled and gestured for me to sit. "You got questions? That's good. Ask away." I sat gingerly on the bench, the sneakers still tingling faintly against my feet. "Where am I?" "That's the wrong question," he said. "The right one is, why are you here?" I had no answer. I didn't even know how to begin to find one. "Let me make it simple," he continued. "You're here because you need to remember. And because these," he tapped the toe of one of my sneakers with his cane, "finally decided you were ready." "What do you mean, remember?" "Remember what?" His smile faded, replaced by something softer, almost sad. "Everything you've forgotten. Everything you've left behind." He pointed at the objects scattered around the clearing. "These are pieces of stories, waiting to be found again. Yours is here too." Before I could ask what he meant, the clearing seemed to shimmer, and suddenly I was no longer sitting on the bench. I was standing in a small, sunlit room filled with books. The air smelled of dust and ink, and a cat dozed lazily on a windowsill. It was a room I knew well, my grandfather's study, a place I hadn't been in years, not since he passed away. On the desk was a leather-bound journal. My journal, the one he'd given me on my 12th birthday, urging me to fill it with stories. I hadn't thought about it in ages, but there it was, as real as the sneakers on my feet. I opened it, and the pages seemed to hum beneath my fingers, words appearing and disappearing like whispers. "This was yours," the old man's voice said, though I couldn't see him anymore. "Your story. You left it unfinished." I flipped through the journal, the weight of its emptiness sinking into me. I hadn't written in it since I was a teenager, since I decided storytelling was a childish dream and moved on to more practical things. But standing there, I realized how much I missed it. The rush of putting pen to paper, the thrill of creating worlds out of nothing. The room dissolved, and I was back in the clearing, the old man watching me with a knowing look. "You remember now?" he asked. I nodded, my throat tight. "I think so." He smiled and handed me the strange instrument he'd been playing. "Good." Then it's your turn. I don't know how, I said, staring at it. You will, he said simply. Just listen. I plucked a string, and the clearing erupted into light and sound. It was like the world itself was singing, harmonizing with the music I didn't know I could create. The objects around us began to glow, lifting into the air, their broken edges mending as the melody grew. It was overwhelming, beautiful, and completely surreal. When it was over, the old man was gone, and the clearing was quiet again. The sneakers nudged me gently, pulling me back toward the path, and I followed, clutching the instrument like a lifeline. When I stepped through the archway and back into the city, the sun was setting, casting everything in a warm, golden light. My sneakers were still old and battered, but they felt different now, alive, purposeful. I walked home, and for the first time in years, I pulled out a notebook and started to write. Have you ever felt like the universe was nudging you towards something you'd forgotten? Something you were always meant to do? Let's start a new story. It was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday, the kind where nothing happens, and that's exactly what I was counting on. I'd slipped out of work early, partly because I could, but mostly because I couldn't stand another hour of spreadsheets, and wandered into the park with a book I had no intention of reading. It was the kind of late afternoon that stretches lazily into evening, where the light slants just right and makes even the mundane feel like a scene from an indie movie. I was halfway through convincing myself that sitting on a park bench counted as unwinding when I noticed the balloon. It was red, brilliant, almost unreal, and hovering low over the duck pond. No string, no child chasing after it, just a lone balloon bobbing in the breeze like it had somewhere important to be. I watched it for a while, waiting for it to pop or get tangled in a tree, but it didn't. It just floated. Something about it felt deliberate, like it was daring me to pay attention. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I stood, tucked my book under my arm, and followed it. It wasn't a dramatic chase or anything. The balloon drifted slowly, lazily, like it knew I'd keep up. It moved through the park, over the bridge, past the ice cream stand where a kid dropped his cone and screamed as if his life were over. The balloon didn't waver, and neither did I. By the time it reached the edge of the park, I felt ridiculous. What was I even doing? Chasing a rogue helium balloon like it held the secrets of the universe? I almost turned back, but then it stopped, hovering right above a small kiosk that I swear hadn't been there before. It looked like something out of a storybook, with a crooked wooden sign that read "Found Things" in uneven, hand-painted letters. The kiosk itself was little more than a glorified shed, its shelves cluttered with jars of buttons, rusty keys, old watches, and other trinkets. Behind the counter stood a woman, her hair a wild tangle of silver curls, her face lined with a kind of warmth that didn't match her sharp, assessing gaze. She looked at me like she'd been expecting me. "You're late," she said, not unkindly. "Late for what?" I asked, feeling immediately stupid. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached under the counter and pulled out a small wooden box, about the size of a jewelry case. It was intricately carved, the lid inlaid with a pattern of swirling lines that seemed to shift when I looked at it too long. "This," she said, sliding it toward me. "I didn't order anything. You didn't need to. It's already yours." I stared at the box, then back at her. "What's in it?" "That's for you to decide." "Decide? What does that even mean?" She smiled then, a knowing, mischievous smile. "Take it. You'll figure it out." The balloon, now hovering just behind her, seemed to agree. It dipped slightly, as if nodding, and I suddenly felt like the idiot in some cosmic joke everyone else understood. Against my better judgment, I picked up the box. It was warm to the touch, like it had been sitting in the sun, and heavier than it looked. "Do I owe you something?" I asked. "Not yet," she said cryptically, and before I could press her further, she turned away to rearrange a row of jars filled with marbles. The balloon was gone when I stepped outside, and so was the kiosk. I spun around, bewildered, but the park was as it had been. Ducks on the pond, joggers on the path, kids chasing frisbees. The only difference was the box in my hands, its carvings catching the last of the sunlight. At home, I set the box on my kitchen table and stared at it, half expecting it to open on its own. When it didn't, I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. Inside was a small slip of paper, blank except for one line written in looping, almost musical handwriting. "What have you lost?" I sat back, the weight of the question sinking in. The first answer that came to mind was stupid. My keys, which I lose every other week. But that didn't feel right. This wasn't about objects, was it? No, this was something deeper. I thought about the things I'd let slip away without noticing. The friendship I'd stopped calling when life got busy. The guitar I hadn't played in years because it reminded me of a version of myself I didn't think I could be anymore. The mornings I used to spend wandering aimlessly, letting the day unfold instead of planning it to death. And then, almost without realizing it, I said out loud, "My wonder." The box shuddered, not violently, just enough to make the carving shimmer and shift again. When it stopped, another note lay inside. "Found things have a habit of finding you. Keep looking." I still don't know what the box was or how it worked. I don't know who the woman was, or the balloon, or why any of it happened. But I do know that the next morning, I called that old friend, pulled the guitar out of its case, and let myself play badly and without purpose for an hour. Now, the box sits on my bookshelf. Every so often, I open it, and there's always a new question waiting, always something I didn't realize I'd forgotten. So, have you ever felt like something small, something you couldn't explain, pushed you to find a part of yourself you didn't even know you'd lost?